Today, we will explore a dramatic story about the relentless struggle between an individual and the forces manipulating power, where justice is finally served after years of deception and oppression. This is the story of Ryan Hayes, an heir to a family land who boldly confronted Laura Brooks and the Riverside Estates HOA board, those who exploited their power to seize the land and assets of the residents in the neighborhood. With financial fraud tactics, land record manipulation, and oppressive decisions, Laura and the HOA board turned the lives of innocent residents into endless suffering. But no one expected that, amidst the darkness of fraud, a resilient heir would rise up, uncover the truth, and fight to protect what belonged to his family. And even more, to protect the rights of the entire community. This story is not just a legal battle, but a testament to the strength of unity and perseverance. Ryan not only reclaimed his inherited land, but also helped the Riverside Estates community regain justice, building a fair, sustainable living environment that respects the rights of each individual. Throughout this story, many of you will likely feel anger at the manipulation and injustice that the Riverside Estates residents endured. The story is not just a lesson in fighting for justice, but a reminder of the power of a community standing up against oppression. We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions about the situations in this story. Do you think HOA power should be more strictly regulated? Or is there a way communities like Riverside Estates can protect themselves from such abuses of power? Don't forget to leave your thoughts and share your feelings in the comments. And make sure you don't miss the next chapter of this story, as more surprises and drama await. Watch until the end and join us in this journey to uncover justice. One June morning, when I was still deep in my late sleep after a long night in Riverside City, the phone suddenly rang. The sound of the ringtone startled me awake. When I looked at the screen, I saw only Mrs. Harris's number, the longtime neighbor of my grandfather for the past 40 years. I picked up the phone, expecting to hear a greeting or some usual news. But no, her voice trembled, so tense that I could hear her breath catching through the phone. Ryan, they're building houses on your land. They started digging yesterday. You need to come back immediately. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What are they doing on my land? I asked again, unable to believe what I had just heard. Mrs. Harris continued, her voice full of worry. They've put up signs and have construction machinery there. A huge excavator tearing up your family's land. I fear they'll trespass on everything. My mean spoon. How could this happen? That land was my inheritance from my grandfather, who had spent years protecting and maintaining it. I had heard him talk about all the plans to protect that land, and now it was being taken right before my eyes. My grandfather didn't sell the land to anyone. I muttered, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. I couldn't hesitate any longer. I immediately left the apartment and drove to Evergreen Farm. A feeling of unease weighed heavily on my chest, but I knew I had to get there right away. The road from Riverside to Evergreen Farm was a 5-hour drive, but the time seemed to stretch twice as long in my mind. With every mile, I felt my anxiety grow. The scenery outside the car window gradually changed, from the bustling, noisy city streets to the peaceful fields I had known since childhood. The narrow, winding roads took me through the lush green countryside. The tranquility of the countryside, which used to make me feel at peace, now felt strange, as if it had been invaded by an uncontrollable force. As I neared Evergreen Farm, I began to see drastic changes on the familiar road. The landscape was no longer the green fields and gentle hills I used to drive past since I was young. Instead, construction signs and the dust from the active machinery took over the space, creating a chaotic scene that I couldn't believe. The closer I got, the more I felt the stark difference. The booming sounds of machinery echoed across the formerly peaceful rural space. The engine noise, metal clanging against metal, and the roar of bulldozers tearing up the ground painted a chaotic picture, a far cry from the peaceful days when my grandfather had been here. The dirt road I used to stroll along had now become a noisy, dusty construction site. Dust filled the air, blurring the familiar images of the old wooden houses and winding roads, as if they were being forgotten in the frenzy of the giant machinery. The scene grew more intense when I saw a crew of workers in protective gear, moving like ghosts under the scorching sun, seemingly unaware of the pain I was experiencing. A giant excavator with a long arm plunged into the earth, cutting through a thick layer of soil, the muddy sludge flying into the air as if it were tearing apart the history of my family piece by piece. The sight made me dizzy as small chunks of dirt fell, creating thick clouds of dust that enveloped the whole space. The air felt heavy and suffocating. Another bulldozer moved across the ground, making me think of a giant monster swallowing up the land my grandfather had spent years nurturing. The earth was being ruthlessly torn up, and the trees that had once been lush were now left with deep scars, like wounds that were slowly spreading. The crops my grandfather had planted to provide food for the family had been destroyed, leaving no trace of life. Not far from there, I saw a huge sign standing tall in the dusty chaos, with bold letters. Future home of Riverside Estates. 72 luxury homes, starting at $600,000. The words hit me like a bucket of cold water, snapping me out of my daze. 72 luxurious homes, built on my family's land, the land my grandfather had protected for so many years. Every house, every square foot of land, was an invasion of a piece of memory, an unforgivable theft. The gusts of dust swept through, making me feel even more helpless. The scene before me made me feel like everything had been stolen, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Trucks carrying materials were constantly coming in and out of the construction site, roaring, their engines loud, but no one stopped to pay attention to the pain of someone watching their most familiar possessions being destroyed. Since my grandfather passed away, I hadn't been prepared for what was happening. This feeling is indescribable. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. The construction site was swallowing everything, memories, everything my grandfather had built over his life. When I stepped out of the car, I saw a woman standing apart from the workers. She wore a crisp white shirt and beige pants, standing with an air of confidence, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around her. I walked up to her and spoke, though an unsettling feeling rose inside me. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice trying to stay calm, even though my heart was in turmoil. She looked up, her gaze unfriendly. She extended her hand, very politely, but with no warmth. "We are preparing for a residential development project. I am Laura Brooks, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association." She spoke in a tone as if I were someone who didn't understand the situation. A surge of anger rose in me. "This is my land," I said, no longer holding back. "My grandfather, William Hayes, owned this land, and I am the heir." She just smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be mistaken. This land was bought by us last year, and we have all the proper permits." She continued coldly, as though she were talking about an object, not the land my family had cherished for generations. I couldn't believe what she was saying. "I don't believe it. I want to see all the documentation proving it." I wasn't about to leave without clear answers. She handed me a business card, then turned and walked away, unconcerned. I stood there, feeling abandoned, watching the excavators continue to destroy what my grandfather had preserved. When I couldn't bear the sight any longer, I turned back to the car and drove back to Evergreen Farm. I couldn't do anything else. I knew I had to get answers immediately, and there was only one place to go. That was my grandfather's office. My grandfather's office, which had long been the place where I found peace during my visits, was eerily silent now. Stepping into the room, I couldn't help but feel as though he were still sitting there, in his old wooden chair, with the dim oil lamp and the books scattered on the desk. But he was no longer there. The room still held the image of a time that could never be returned, but it also seemed to hold secrets that I needed to uncover. The smell of old cigarettes and dust covered the room, as if time had stopped the moment he passed. The faint smell of the faded books and the yellowing pages made me feel as if I were reliving the old memories. The room was full of memories, with old newspapers, notebooks recording all the events of his life, and family photos that had turned yellow. Everything spoke of a past that had passed, but I needed to find something that could help me address the current situation. I walked around the room, my eyes scanning the bookshelves, the boxes, and the old photos on the walls. A sense of disappointment grew as I didn't find anything useful. I turned back to my grandfather's desk, where he had sat every night writing his notes about work, the farm, and the things he saw during the day. The drawers had not been opened in a long time, and the ledgers were piled up high. I opened each drawer, searching through the old papers, but found nothing that could help me resolve my current questions. Only when I touched the old wooden desk did something unexpected happen. A faint creak sounded from under the desk, and I sensed an irregularity in the desk. Something wasn't right. I bent down, looked closer, and then discovered a loose board, almost forgotten for years. With my hand, I gently lifted the board. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as I saw a small metal box hidden beneath it. The box was made of old metal, with scratches and signs of wear from time. I slowly opened the box, and what was inside made my heart skip a beat. A pile of papers was tightly packed inside. The first was my grandfather's will, clearly stating that he had left this land to me. All the property was mine upon his death. This not only reassured me, but also confirmed my legal rights to the land. I sat down in my grandfather's old chair, my eyes still fixed on the words in the letter. This was a message my grandfather had left for me, a warning, a clear directive that I had to follow to protect my family in this land. If you are reading this letter, it means you are facing those who wish to take what we have worked so hard to build. They will not give up easily, but you must remember that everything belongs to you. Never let them take our family's property without resistance. As I read these words, I felt my heart tighten. My grandfather was not just a farmer, but a wise man who had foreseen that some would try to seize this land. The land was not just property. It was the soul of my family, of generations who had carefully nurtured it. He had known this battle would not be easy, and he had prepared everything for me to continue. They tried to deceive me into selling the land, but I refused. The people from Riverside Estates used all sorts of tactics to convince me, from empty promises to unclear contracts. But I never signed any papers. You must remember, the papers they give you are not trustworthy. Everything is a lie. If you want to protect this land, you must find the original documents, especially the maps from 1910. My grandfather emphasized the importance of these original documents. The old land maps were the most solid evidence to prove my family's ownership. I could picture in my mind the image of my grandfather sitting at his desk, his eyes old but determined, and the memories of times when he refused to sell the land, times when he was firm in not letting anyone take what belonged to our family. I understood that these maps were the key to proving the truth. In the letter, he continued, "These documents are not easy to find. They have been carefully hidden. You must find them, and when you do, you will see the truth. The truth will help you protect this land. Remember, if you do nothing, if you let them take it, we will have nothing left." My grandfather's final message struck a chord deep within me. I realized he had prepared for this battle, knowing that one day I would have to face these greedy people, those willing to do anything to seize our family's property. My grandfather had not just left me an inheritance, but also a valuable lesson in resilience and the protection of sacred values. The weight of responsibility was heavier than ever. This was not just a fight for the land, but for the family legacy, for those who had carefully built and protected it over the years. My grandfather trusted me, passed all this responsibility to me, and I couldn't let him down. As I folded the letter, I felt a new strength rise within me. His directions were a guiding light, and I would not back down. I stood up, regained my composure and determination, and looked at the metal box with the important documents, the land maps, and evidence I needed to uncover. I knew I had to continue searching for the original documents, especially the maps from 1910. These documents would be the legal tools that would help me protect not only this land, but also my family, protecting what my grandfather had worked so hard to build and leave to us. What I was doing was not just for me, but for my grandfather, for the legacy, and for all the generations who had been tied to this land. There was no more time to delay. I knew I needed help from someone who understood the law. Gregory Finch was the only person I could trust in this town. He was experienced in land disputes and always respected for his caution and skill in the job. He was not easily deceived by trickery, and I needed someone like him to help me deal with the greedy people from Riverside Estates. After leaving Evergreen Farm, I called Gregory and asked for an urgent meeting. He agreed to meet me that afternoon at 3 p.m. at his office. I knew I would be facing a long and difficult legal battle, but I had no other choice. I couldn't let these intruders destroy everything my family had worked for. When I walked into Gregory's office, he was sitting behind his desk, deeply focused on some documents. His serious expression, but bright eyes, always made me feel at ease. I took out the metal box I had found in my grandfather's office and placed it on the table in front of him. "Gregory, I need your help," I said, my voice firm but filled with anxiety. "I found these documents at Evergreen Farm. These are old land maps and my grandfather's will. According to these documents, I discovered that my family's land is being unlawfully trespassed. The people from Riverside Estates are building on my land without proper consent." Gregory stayed silent for a few seconds, flipping through the papers in the box. His eyes lit up when he saw the old land maps, and I could tell he was thinking carefully. "These maps are very important." Gregory finally spoke, his voice full of certainty. "You did a great job finding these documents. According to these maps from 1910, the boundaries of your family's land are much larger than what the current records show. This could be strong evidence to prove your family's ownership." A sense of relief washed over me when I heard his words. But I knew this was just the first step. "But we need to prove that the changes in the land records are unlawful," Gregory continued. "We will need to check the county records to see who made these changes and how we can reverse that decision." We decided to go to the county office that afternoon. I felt tense, but also determined. This was an opportunity to restore my family's rights, and I couldn't let it slip away. When we arrived at the county office, the atmosphere seemed very quiet. The land records were carefully stored, but everything seemed to be neglected. We met a county clerk named Angela, who was responsible for storing the land records. After explaining the situation and asking to see the records related to my family's land, Angela agreed and led us into a room filled with old documents. Gregory began studying the documents Angela provided. Every sheet of paper, every map was carefully examined by him. Meanwhile, I just stood still, watching his every move, feeling like time was dragging on. After a long while, Gregory stopped, his sharp gaze focused. "We've found it," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of confusion. "The changes in these land records were clearly made without your grandfather's consent. A small change was made in 1984, but later, in 1997, a large change took place, reducing your family's land boundaries by nearly 80 acres. Notably, these documents are signed by your grandfather, and there are signs they may have been forged." A rush of anger and worry surged within me. Everything I had thought was clear now seemed like an obvious fraud. The people from Riverside Estates had used forged documents to legitimize the takeover of my family's land. Gregory looked at me. "Ryan, we have the evidence. This could be a solid legal basis for us to reverse these changes and protect your family's rights." My investigation had entered a new phase, and it felt like I was diving deeper into a maze with no way out. Every trace, every clue I found brought me closer to the truth. But at the same time, it made me feel like I was being pulled into a dangerous whirlpool where everything was no longer as simple as I thought. One cold morning, after completing the review of the documents at the county office, I sat back in Gregory Finch's office, trying to connect the scattered pieces. Beside me was a pile of faded documents, copies of papers, and scribbled notes I had gathered. Gregory had left for a while, giving me space to think about what I had discovered. I still couldn't forget the sharp look in his eyes when we uncovered the unlawful changes in the land records. But one question continued to haunt me. Who was behind all this? And then, like a flash of lightning in my mind, I began to connect the dots. The old maps I had found showed that not only had my family's land been invaded, but there was also a much larger network. It felt like there was some force behind it, manipulating everything from the shadows. I needed to clarify this. I needed to know who was pulling the strings. Following the trail, I began investigating suspicious financial transactions related to Riverside Estates. The papers I had collected earlier pointed to some strange contracts. All the contracts related to Riverside Estates had several unfamiliar names appearing repeatedly. I sighed, realizing that all of these names had one thing in common. They weren't strangers, but people holding power in this area. I touched the documents related to real estate transactions. One of them clearly stated that Riverside Estates had received a huge loan from a financial company called Sunshine Consulting LLC, which had close ties with several local government officials. As I continued to review the records, I discovered a series of suspicious money transfers from the HOA to related companies. Companies that not only backed Riverside Estates, but also had shady connections with members of the board. "Here it is," I whispered, when I saw a string of transactions transferring money from the HOA account to Laura Brooks' personal account. A large sum of money, perhaps compensation or even a commission from land deals. Each transaction was not only suspicious in timing, but also had odd discrepancies in the amounts, as if they were trying to hide something. I felt tense with every breath, knowing I was stepping into dangerous territory. An undeniable truth was slowly revealing itself. Laura Brooks, the HOA president, and the board members had not only been involved in illegal land transactions, they had manipulated the entire financial system of this area, exploiting their power and connections to seize land from vulnerable residents, coercing them into selling their properties for pennies on the dollar. I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had been deceived, blackmailed by the very people they trusted, like Mr. Grayson, who had to sell his land after a series of unreasonable fines from the HOA, or other families who were forced to pay exorbitant, unexplained fees, making it impossible for them to keep their land. And now, these people were trying to take my family's land. It was time for me to act, but I couldn't do this alone. I needed to gather more evidence, dig deeper into this web of fraud. I needed to follow all these traces until the truth was exposed. I stood up, walked toward the window of Gregory's office, looking outside with a heavy heart. It felt as though I had touched a dark corner of the world that no one wanted to face. But I couldn't stop. I would go all the way, even if I had to face the most powerful people in this town. My eyes stared at the foggy clouds on the horizon, a new determination forming within me. Manipulation, fraud, all of it would be exposed, and I would be the one to bring that truth to light. Finally, after days of intense investigation and gathering irrefutable evidence, I was ready for a direct confrontation with Laura Brooks and those behind Riverside Estates. The Riverside Estates community meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, July 12, 2022, according to the Homeowners Association's notice. This was the annual meeting, but this time it was special because I decided to reveal the truth about the shady deals and manipulations that Laura and the HOA board had carried out. Over 200 residents of Riverside Estates were present in the hall, from homeowners who had bought properties in the development to those who had been forced to sell their land under pressure from the HOA. They all came to hear the latest information about the project and important decisions regarding the community. But I didn't come here to hear Laura Brooks' empty promises. I came here to tell the truth. When I entered the hall, everyone's eyes were on me. I knew that what I was about to do would surprise many, but it was also time for them to know the truth that Laura had tried to conceal for so long. My heart raced, but I couldn't back down. I walked straight to the podium, opened a briefcase containing important documents, the original land maps from 1910, the shady financial transactions, and the evidence I had gathered. I began with a confident statement. I am Ryan Hayes, the rightful heir to Evergreen Farm, and I am here today to protect the rights of my family and all of you, the deceived residents. I raised the original land map, pointing to the clear boundaries from 1910. This land does not belong to Riverside Estates. You have no right to build on it. My family's land was illegally seized, and I have proof of that. Laura Brooks immediately stood up, trying to maintain her composure. This is nonsense. Our permits are completely legal, she protested, trying to shut down my accusations. I don't care about your permits, I coldly replied. I care about the shady financial transactions that you and your board have been involved in. What you've done is manipulate the system to seize my family's property, and I have the evidence. I presented the documents, pointing to a specific transaction. In 1997, the boundaries of my family's land were changed without legal consent. 80 acres of our land were cut off and transferred to Riverside Estates. This is an illegal change. People in the hall began to murmur, residents exchanging looks, eyes filled with doubt about what Laura had been saying. Not only that, I continued, Riverside Estates took a $16 million loan from Sunshine Consulting LLC, a company with close ties to Laura and the HOA members. These funds were transferred into her personal account and others in the board, manipulating land transactions and ownership. Laura stood up quickly, her eyes blazing with fury. This is slander. I can't let you continue lying to everyone, she yelled. I did not back down. You can keep protesting, but the truth is clear. This is your document from Riverside Estates, and I have all the evidence. You cannot deny it anymore." My words brought an eerie silence over the hall. The residents around me began to talk, whispers filling the air, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Laura tried to maintain her calm, but I could clearly see the worry in her eyes. "You'll pay for these accusations," Laura said in a threatening tone, but with less power than before. "You can't do anything. The town officials, those here, they'll stand with Riverside Estates." I smiled, but I didn't let her gain the upper hand. "You think those officials can help you? You think they can stop me from revealing the truth? I don't need the support of the corrupt. I have the support of this community." The residents began to stand up, clapping and speaking out. A man from the back started speaking. "You're right, Ryan. We've been deceived for too long." The entire hall started clapping, and the applause grew louder. The people of Riverside Estates, those who had been forced to sell their land, those who had suffered under the HOA's manipulation, were now standing up and showing their support. Laura no longer had the strength to resist. She just stood still, her face pale, unable to say another word. "From today, all these transactions will be investigated. I won't let you and your board continue to deceive us," I said, my voice firm. Finally, Laura lowered her head and walked out, not saying another word. The confrontation was over, and I knew I had gained the support of this community. The land was no longer just my family's. It was for all those who had been deceived by Riverside Estates. The atmosphere in the hall was completely different from when I first entered. The residents of Riverside Estates were no longer silent, no longer waiting for Laura Brooks' ridiculous excuses. They started standing up, eyes full of determination. Something inside me had completely changed, and I could feel the growing unity of this community. I was no longer alone. Every eye in the room was on me, and I knew I couldn't back down. I turned to face the crowd, speaking loudly and clearly. "We can't continue letting these corrupt people deceive us. Laura Brooks and the HOA members have exploited their power to force you to sell your land, to push you into unreasonable fees, and they have stolen our property. We must stand up, protect our rights, and the rights of the families they've taken from." The clapping began again, louder than ever. Margaret Turner, a 68-year-old woman, stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "I've lived in Riverside Estates for 40 years. This land, this house, it's all mine. But for years, the HOA has constantly tried to force me to comply with unreasonable regulations. 2 years ago, I planted a small flower garden in my front yard. The colorful flowers made this neighborhood feel more alive. But shortly after, they sent me a letter saying I violated the landscaping rules. They told me I had to remove the whole garden or be fined $1,000 a month. I tried to protest, but they said if I didn't comply, they'd seize my land." She paused for a moment, looking around, then continued. "In the end, I had no choice but to remove the garden because I couldn't handle the fines anymore. And I know this is just one of many tactics they use to force people like me to sell land or reduce our property. Today, I'm here to say I will no longer be silent." Richard Bennett, an elderly man, stood up and gave a forced smile. "I've lived here since Riverside Estates was founded. I've been attached to this land for 50 years. But I've never seen the HOA act so ruthlessly. They demanded I fix my yard's fence, saying it didn't meet the community standards. But my fence wasn't damaged. It was just an old wooden fence, not harming anyone. Then they fined me $500 and demanded I repair it within a week, or they'd fine me more." He paused and looked directly into Laura Brooks' eyes. "And the worst part is, when I couldn't fix it in time, they sent me a notice saying I violated the regulations and began the process to seize part of my land. I had to sell part of my land to pay off the fine. If I didn't, they would force me to sell my entire property. It's shameful that the government and the HOA side with the rich, letting them manipulate and squeeze people like me." Sarah Jenkins, a single mother, stood up and shared her story. "A few years ago, my husband, Tom, and I bought a small plot in Riverside Estates. When I decided to plant a vegetable garden for our family, they said growing vegetables violated regulations because it didn't meet the aesthetic landscaping standards. I couldn't believe it when I got a notice from the HOA saying we had to remove the garden or face a fine. My husband, who was seriously ill at the time, couldn't do anything, so I had to comply. But the problem didn't stop there." Sarah sighed and continued. "They started imposing enormous and unclear fees. Service fees for maintaining common areas, landscaping adjustment fees. It all piled up into a debt I couldn't afford. Eventually, they said that if we didn't pay, they would sell our house. I couldn't take it anymore, and we had to sell the house for much less than its actual value. Not just the land, but my family lost our home because of the HOA's abuse. Peter McKinney, a young man, stood up and looked around. I bought a house in Riverside Estates 2 years ago, and I have to say, what I went through was shameful. When I moved here, I just wanted a peaceful life. But everything changed as soon as I started renovating my yard. I replaced the old walls in the yard just to make it nicer. But soon after, the HOA sent me a letter demanding I change everything because it didn't comply with the community's general standards. They even threatened that if I didn't comply, I would be fined $200 per month. Peter paused for a moment, then continued in a lower voice. And then a month later, I received another notice from the HOA. They said I violated the house color regulations and demanded I repaint the house. I really couldn't understand what was going on. After some time, they notified me I violated other regulations I'd never heard of, and they would keep fining me, even threatening to seize my property if I didn't pay. I knew this was their tactic to force people like me to sell land. At this point, the unity of the community was no longer just words but action. They were determined not to let those who manipulated continue to use their power to oppress the vulnerable. And I, Ryan Hayes, was not only the heir of Evergreen Farm, but the one who would lead them to justice. We will stand up and fight, I declared, my voice resonating with determination. We will not let these corrupt individuals seize this land. Each one of us has the right to protect what belongs to us, and I will never give up until justice is served. The applause grew louder than ever, a commitment from everyone in the room. They were ready to confront Laura Brooks and those in the HOA, ready to fight for their rights. That meeting became a turning point in the battle against the manipulation of Laura Brooks and those in the HOA. The stories of the residents made me realize one important thing. They were not just victims, but they were people who could change everything if they stood together. I couldn't fight this system alone. We needed a strong organization that could protect the rights of every resident in Riverside Estates and confront the illegal actions the HOA had carried out for many years. We can't let this deception continue, I said, my voice full of resolve as I stood up in the next meeting. Laura Brooks and the HOA board can't keep manipulating us. But if we only fight on our own, we will fail. We need to unite and build a strong organization, one that can protect the rights of all residents and confront their schemes. I paused for a second, letting my words echo through the room. I propose we form the Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition, an association of Riverside Estates residents, with the goal of protecting our rights. Every decision in this community must be made transparently and fairly, and no one will be able to abuse their power to harm us anymore. A wave of quiet discussion began to spread through the hall, but gradually, the residents began to show support. Sarah Jenkins stood up first, her eyes full of resolve. I agree with Ryan, she said, her voice firm. We've been suffering from the HOA's unreasonable rules for too long. Every time we do something small wrong, they fine us or threaten to sell our land. We need an organization that can stand up for us. Soon after, Richard Bennett, the man who had shared the story about his yard fence, also stood up. I support Ryan's idea. We need a collective strength, so we're not manipulated by these people anymore. I lost land and money because of them, but I won't let that happen to others in this community. The feeling of unity and determination spread through the hall. One by one, each person, each family stood up, sharing stories of the oppression they had endured. Their eyes were now filled with hope, no longer fear. They had realized they weren't facing Laura Brooks and Riverside Estates alone anymore. I will fight with you, said Margaret Turner, the woman who had been forced to remove her flower garden. I've had enough of being threatened and fined by people who don't understand this community. If we have an association, at least we will have the strength to protect our rights. People began clapping, the solidarity growing louder. I looked around, feeling like I was no longer just an heir fighting for land, but the leader of a movement for justice. Laura Brooks could no longer threaten us. This community, we had united and were determined. The Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition was not just an organization protecting the rights of residents, but a symbol of the fight for fairness. We would stand up against abuse and protect what belonged to us. After the truth was revealed, not only Laura Brooks, but also the HOA board faced serious legal consequences. Investigations and evidence of financial fraud, shady transactions, and illegal changes in land records made it impossible for Laura and her accomplices to continue manipulating the community. Once the evidence was made public, Laura and the HOA members were investigated by federal and local authorities. The police and financial investigators got involved, collecting additional evidence from bank accounts, transaction records, and fraudulent contracts they had signed. The shady relationship between Laura and local officials was also confirmed, leading to a series of extensive investigations into corruption within the local government. Laura Brooks was charged with multiple serious offenses, including fraud, abuse of power, and financial manipulation. She was arrested and faced trial. After months of hearings, Laura was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud and financial manipulation. The accomplices in the HOA, as well as those involved in changing land boundaries and seizing property, were also sentenced to prison or faced other severe penalties. The illegal money they had taken was ordered to be returned, and a portion was reimbursed to the harmed Riverside Estates residents. The Riverside Estates community not only regained their land, but also reclaimed their rights, which had been stolen for many years. The residents also filed a lawsuit against the HOA for abuse and fraud, demanding back some of the property and illegal fees that the HOA had taken from them over the years. The harmed residents were compensated, and the fraudulent actions of Laura and the HOA board could no longer be tolerated. With the charges confirmed and Laura Brooks and her accomplices sentenced, justice had been served. The Riverside Estates community was no longer manipulated by corrupt individuals. Every decision in this community was now made transparently and fairly, and the community began to thrive, no longer suffering from the unreasonable regulations and fees imposed by the HOA. The Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition became a strong organization, protecting the legal rights of residents and confronting the schemes of corrupt individuals. A year later, Evergreen Farm was not only the inheritance of my family, but it had become a symbol of justice and resilience. The land my grandfather had painstakingly built was now not only where I preserved the family's legacy, but also where the values of fairness and transparency were celebrated. New homes were built with environmentally friendly designs, using recycled materials and renewable energy, with transparent and fair management systems to create a sustainable community in harmony with nature. The Riverside Estates community thrived, with residents no longer threatened by unreasonable fees or rules imposed by the HOA. All decisions were made fairly, without manipulation from people like Laura Brooks. The residents now lived in harmony with nature and respected the legacy my grandfather had left behind. The homes were designed with environmental friendliness in mind, with common areas, green gardens, and open spaces where families could enjoy outdoor living. Solar power systems and energy-saving solutions were widely implemented, helping reduce environmental impact and improving the quality of life for residents. This community was not just where we lived, but where we built a sustainable and fair future together. Everyone in Riverside Estates now had their rights protected, and all participated in the management of the community in a transparent and fair way. The unity of the community created a harmonious living environment where everyone respected each other and worked together to develop this neighborhood. Looking back at Evergreen Farm, I no longer saw just an inheritance, but proof of my family's ongoing battle and the community's. We fought together to protect the core values of fairness and freedom. The houses now weren't just buildings, but symbols of resilience and the power of a community to fight against injustice. The Riverside Estates community has undergone a complete transformation. The oppressed residents have regained their power and can now live freely in a fair environment, where they no longer have to endure manipulation and abuse of power. Evergreen Farm is now not just my family's legacy, but also part of a sustainable and just community. The story of Ryan Hayes and his legal battle with Laura Brooks and the Riverside Estates HOA board is a living testament to the power of resilience and determination in the fight for justice. Financial investigations, the exposure of fraudulent actions, and the abuse of power have restored justice to its rightful place. Laura and her accomplices faced appropriate legal consequences, and the Riverside Estates community can now live in a transparent, fair, and sustainable environment. But this story is not just Ryan's or his family's victory. It is the victory of the entire community. The residents of Riverside Estates, after years of being manipulated, have regained their voice. They stood together, fighting not just for their own rights, but also for the core values of fairness and the protection of everyone's legal rights. Now, Evergreen Farm is not just Ryan's family inheritance, but also a symbol of justice and resilience. The homes that have been rebuilt are not only made from sustainable materials, but also embody human values, representing unity and determination to never back down. So, what do you think about the situations in this story? Should HOA organizations be more tightly regulated to prevent the abuse of power and negative impacts on the community? Please share your thoughts in the comments, as this story does not end here. It opens an important dialogue about how we protect our rights and the community around us. Thank you for following this dramatic story. Don't forget to follow and continue reading the upcoming stories, where we will bring deeper insights into law, politics, and life. HOA Karen increased the fine for too many cars, not knowing I'm the most powerful one here. The feeling when power is abused, when you have to live under the control of someone who is completely unfair. Surely many of us have experienced this. But today's story will change everything. Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, abused her power to impose unreasonable rules, making the lives of the neighborhood residents miserable. However, Michael Carter, an ordinary resident, refused to stay silent. Will he be able to bring justice? Don't leave yet. Watch this story till the end to see how dramatic the outcome is. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever encountered someone abusing their power like this? Let us know. I never thought I would go to war with my HOA. I'm the kind of person who enjoys peace, doesn't get involved in the neighborhood politics, and certainly doesn't get caught up in HOA drama. I pay my dues on time, keep my lawn neat, don't throw noisy parties, and I get along with my neighbors. But one seemingly normal morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and found a bright orange notice taped to my door, as if someone wanted to make sure I couldn't ignore it. Violation notice. HOA fee will increase by $500 per month due to excessive vehicles on property. Violation. Vehicle count exceeds allowed limit. I blinked, read it again, hoping I was mistaken. But no, the words were clearly printed on the paper. Too many cars? I only have 3. My work truck, which I need for my construction business, my wife Emily's SUV, which she uses to commute to the hospital for her late-night shifts, and lastly, a used Honda, a birthday gift for my daughter Olivia's 16th birthday. I clenched the paper, anger rising like a tidal wave. 3 cars in my driveway. That's perfectly normal anywhere in the U.S. But in this HOA, run by Karen Mitchell, things are never that simple. Karen wasn't just a powerful woman. She was a full-fledged HOA tyrant, the kind of person who believed every rule in the neighborhood must be enforced according to her whims, with no exceptions. As I stepped inside, my wife spoke from the living room, her voice cautious. "Michael, Karen's out there again." I lifted my coffee cup, slowly walked to the window. And sure enough, there she was. Karen Mitchell, the HOA boss, was walking across my lawn in her usual manner, clipboard in hand, measuring tape in one hand, phone ready to snap photos. This was the 3rd time this week I'd caught her snooping around, taking pictures of my property. I gripped the coffee cup handle, feeling like I was holding a weapon instead of a morning drink. She wasn't just a rule enforcer. Karen was a control freak, a person who liked to see others grovel at her feet. The kind of person who thought the HOA was her personal kingdom, where all the residents were her subjects, bound to follow her every command. "Do you think we can park the Honda in the garage?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with worry. I set the coffee cup down, sighed. "Our garage is full already, remember? Half of it's filled with my construction tools, the other half with your medical supplies. And besides, we shouldn't have to hide our daughter's car like it's some kind of crime." Emily nodded slowly, but I could see the clear anxiety in her eyes. Karen was not the type to back off easily. I turned back to the window. She was still there, holding up her phone, snapping photos of my driveway like she was collecting evidence for some kind of trial. These petty acts might seem insignificant to many, but I knew exactly what kind of person Karen was, an obsessive powermonger, someone who took pleasure in seeing others suffer. The problem was, she'd picked the wrong target this time. Karen might think this was just a small battle over parking, but what she didn't know was that I had been planning for 5 years. While she was busy enjoying her little power trip, imposing irrational rules, I had quietly been buying up properties in the neighborhood. Every time a house went up for sale, I bought it, but never in my own name. I used multiple LLCs, each owning a small number of properties to avoid detection. And now, I own 67% of this neighborhood. What does that mean? It means I wasn't just a resident getting bullied by the HOA anymore. I was the true power here. And now, it was time to teach Karen a lesson she would never forget. Karen didn't waste any time escalating the situation. After I received the ridiculous violation notice, she started her harassment campaign more openly. Less than a week later, I saw a series of other residents in the neighborhood receiving similar fines. The Parker family was fined $250 for having a relative's pickup truck parked in front of their house during a weekend visit. Mrs. Williams, 82 years old, was fined $150 for having flowers too tall in her yard, even though the gardens of Karen's close friends went unchecked. Mr. Nguyen, a science teacher, received a warning for his car sticking out slightly into the street during a snowstorm just days before. The issue was that the horrible snowstorm that had just passed over the neighborhood had left the streets covered in thick snow. In this situation, many people had no choice but to park on the street since there was no available parking. Mr. Nguyen, the high school science teacher, was one of those affected. His car slightly extended onto the sidewalk due to the snowstorm, but clearly, there was no other option for parking. Yet, Karen showed no empathy whatsoever. Even Mr. Nguyen received a fine from the HOA for blocking the sidewalk due to improper parking during the snowstorm. This was an obviously unreasonable and unfair decision. The entire neighborhood was living in a state of confusion. No one was sure who would be targeted next. Any resident who wasn't part of Karen's group of friends felt like they were walking on a tightrope, knowing that Karen would stop at nothing to find reasons to bring them down. Around this time, I received an email from the HOA announcing an emergency meeting, with the sole agenda being discussion of parking issues in the neighborhood and its impact on the living environment. I immediately realized this wasn't going to be a regular meeting. Just as I had anticipated, Karen's true objective was to attack me and destroy anyone who dared to challenge her authority. This meeting was nothing less than an open war, and I was the target. That evening, I walked into the community center where the meeting was being held. The atmosphere in the room was tense enough to be cut with a knife. Over 40 residents were present, most of whom had previously been unfairly targeted by the HOA. Karen stood in the middle of the room, her familiar pink clipboard in hand, her face exuding confidence. She had staged everything perfectly to create a dramatic performance. She was certain she could control everything. "Let's get started," Karen said sharply, tapping her small pink gavel on the table as if she were a judge in a courtroom. On the big screen, the first image appeared, a series of photos of my front yard, taken from every angle, with red circles around each car, as if they were evidence in a criminal case. "This is the situation we are facing," Karen said, her voice filled with indignation. "Some residents are turning their driveways into public parking lots, ruining the aesthetic of this neighborhood. As you can see, the most obvious example is Michael Carter's house." I squinted, looking closely at the photos. They were taken at various times throughout the day, morning, noon, and even at 3 a.m. Karen hadn't just taken pictures. She had covertly done it in the middle of the night, trying to make me feel guilty about the cars in my driveway. I turned to look at Emily, my wife. She was also staring, shocked by what Karen was doing. "She woke up in the middle of the night to take pictures of our yard?" Emily whispered. Karen continued her speech, moving from one photo to another, each time emphasizing the aesthetic damage she claimed was caused by my cars. "Some residents have expressed concern that if we don't take action soon, this neighborhood will turn into a chaotic parking lot," she said, her hand sweeping across the photos with a clear bias. Then Karen started showing a chart, a red and black graph that supposedly showed property value decline, caused by the parking issue. This graph was nothing more than fabricated numbers that Karen had created to make her argument seem more convincing. "Based on our research," Karen continued, "neighborhoods with strict parking regulations typically see property values rise by an average of 5 to 7% each year, while those that don't regulate parking see a decrease of 3 to 4%. We must act now before this gets out of control." I leaned back in my chair, trying to suppress a smile. So this was how she manipulated the truth? First of all, there was no research supporting the idea that property values drop just because there are a few extra cars in the driveway. There was no credible evidence, just numbers that Karen had made up to manipulate the crowd. Second, if parking regulations were really that important, then why were Karen's friends exempt from fines? I looked around the room and saw a few residents starting to waver, while others, who had previously been fined by Karen, were clenching their fists, clearly realizing this was nothing more than a political theater. I could have stood up immediately and exposed the absurdity of this, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, observing everything like a patient spectator. I knew Karen was trying to manipulate the emotions of the crowd, and the best way to deal with people like her was to let them hang themselves with their own abuse of power. Karen continued speaking for about 15 more minutes before presenting a petition for a new vehicle regulation, a rule that would limit each household to 2 cars, and any additional vehicles would have to be parked in the garage. I heard some murmurs of dissatisfaction from the crowd, but no one dared to speak up. Finally, Karen flashed a triumphant smile and said, "I propose we vote to approve this regulation today." At that moment, I sat up straight. "Hold on, Karen," I said, my voice calm but loud enough for the entire room to hear. Karen paused, narrowing her eyes at me. "Do you have something to say, Michael?" I smiled slightly, looked around the room, then slowly stood up. "Before we vote," I said, "I think there are a few things everyone in this room should know first." The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift immediately. I could feel the tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for a battle to break out right here. Every eye in the room was on me, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Karen stood there, still holding her initial confident stance, but I knew her smile would slowly fade. I slowly pulled a thick folder from my leather bag and placed it on the table, the sound of paper and covers hitting the surface like a silent declaration of war. I glanced around the room, pausing in silence just long enough for everyone to feel the change in the atmosphere. This was the moment that would decide everything. I looked into Karen's eyes, noticing the worry starting to creep onto her face. It was no surprise, because what I was about to present would expose the deception Karen had been hiding for years. The first piece of evidence I pulled out was the list of properties I had purchased in this neighborhood, including more than 67% of the homes in the development. Each document contained the name of the property, the address, and the company I had used to buy them through various LLCs. I hadn't just bought these homes as an investment. Now, I owned a significant portion of the land, and according to HOA rules, I had become the largest property owner in the area. I stared at Karen, not rushing to speak, just letting the evidence silently speak for itself. Her face began to pale, and I could feel the panic starting to rise in Karen's eyes as she realized she was facing a stronger opponent than she'd ever imagined. I continued to flip through the documents, then presented the second piece of evidence, the documents showing how Karen had imposed rules with a clear bias, specifically targeting families that weren't in her circle of friends. I opened a thick file and quoted HOA meetings from last year. I pointed out a few typical examples where Karen selectively fined those who didn't obey her. The Williams family, an elderly couple who always kept their yard clean, was fined $250 for having roses that were too vibrant, which supposedly disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. But when Karen's family planted a bright red flower that was almost too vivid, according to the rules, she wasn't fined. Mr. Nguyen, the local high school science teacher, was fined for having his car slightly over the sidewalk during the snowstorm. But Karen deliberately ignored her friends who parked over the line without any penalty. Miss Susan, one of Karen's close friends, had a bright purple fence, which according to HOA rules was not allowed, but she was never fined despite violating the rules for over a year. These examples didn't just expose Karen's bias. They revealed a stark reality. Karen had been using her power to enforce rules unjustly, simply to protect her friends and allies. After presenting this evidence, I moved on to the HOA's financial records. This was the third piece of evidence, and one of the most damaging blows to Karen. I not only had documents about HOA meetings, but also financial reports for the last 5 years. On the big screen, I displayed the HOA's financial chart. I pointed to the figures and details. $50,000 was lost in a pool renovation project, a project that never even happened, but the money was already paid out. $30,000 had been transferred into Karen's personal account, with no valid reason. Several other funds from the HOA budget were used for Karen's personal parties and her luxurious vacation to Maui. These expenses were logged under the guise of community activities, but in reality, they were her personal trips. The room fell silent. All eyes were fixed on the figures. It seemed like everyone had finally realized the truth that Karen had been trying to hide all along. I looked at Karen, and she no longer had any of her previous confidence. Her face was pale, and I could see panic starting to show. But Karen didn't give up easily. She quickly stood up, gripping her small pink gavel, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Everything you're saying is slander," Karen yelled, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing wrong. Those documents are fake, exaggerations." I didn't rush to respond. There was no need to say anything more. I just gave her the time to panic, to let the residents in the room realize that her deceit had been exposed. People in the room started whispering to each other. Then groups of them stood up. No one was supporting Karen anymore. She had been completely exposed. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift immediately. I could feel the tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for a battle to break out right here. Every eye in the room was on me, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Karen stood there, still holding her initial confident stance, but I knew her smile would slowly fade. I slowly pulled a thick folder from my leather bag and placed it on the table, the sound of paper and covers hitting the surface like a silent declaration of war. I glanced around the room, pausing in silence just long enough for everyone to feel the change in the atmosphere. This was the moment that would decide everything. I looked into Karen's eyes, noticing the worry starting to creep onto her face. It was no surprise, because what I was about to present would expose the deception Karen had been hiding for years. The first piece of evidence I pulled out was the list of properties I had purchased in this neighborhood, including more than 67% of the homes in the development. Each document contained the name of the property, the address, and the company I had used to buy them through various LLCs. I hadn't just bought these homes as an investment. Now, I owned a significant portion of the land, and according to HOA rules, I had become the largest property owner in the area. I stared at Karen, not rushing to speak, just letting the evidence silently speak for itself. Her face began to pale, and I could feel the panic starting to rise in Karen's eyes as she realized she was facing a stronger opponent than she'd ever imagined. I continued to flip through the documents, then presented the second piece of evidence. The documents showing how Karen had imposed rules with a clear bias, specifically targeting families that weren't in her circle of friends. I opened a thick file and quoted HOA meetings from last year. I pointed out a few typical examples where Karen selectively fined those who didn't obey her. The Williams family, an elderly couple who always kept their yard clean, was fined $250 for having roses that were too vibrant, which supposedly disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. But when Karen's family planted a bright red flower that was almost too vivid, according to the rules, she wasn't fined. Mr. Nguyen, the local high school science teacher, was fined for having his car slightly over the sidewalk during the snowstorm. But Karen deliberately ignored her friends who parked over the line without any penalty. Miss Susan, one of Karen's close friends, had a bright purple fence, which according to HOA rules was not allowed, but she was never fined despite violating the rules for over a year. These examples didn't just expose Karen's bias. They revealed a stark reality. Karen had been using her power to enforce rules unjustly, simply to protect her friends and allies. After presenting this evidence, I moved on to the HOA's financial records. This was the third piece of evidence, and one of the most damaging blows to Karen. I not only had documents about HOA meetings, but also financial reports for the last 5 years. On the big screen, I displayed the HOA's financial chart. I pointed to the figures and details. $50,000 was lost in a pool renovation project, a project that never even happened, but the money was already paid out. $30,000 had been transferred into Karen's personal account, with no valid reason. Several other funds from the HOA budget were used for Karen's personal parties and her luxurious vacation to Maui. These expenses were logged under the guise of community activities, but in reality, they were her personal trips. The room fell silent. All eyes were fixed on the figures. It seemed like everyone had finally realized the truth that Karen had been trying to hide all along. I looked at Karen, and she no longer had any of her previous confidence. Her face was pale, and I could see panic starting to show. But Karen didn't give up easily. She quickly stood up, gripping her small pink gavel, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Everything you're saying is slander," Karen yelled, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing wrong. Those documents are fake, exaggerations." I didn't rush to respond. There was no need to say anything more. I just gave her the time to panic, to let the residents in the room realize that her deceit had been exposed. People in the room started whispering to each other. Then groups of them stood up. No one was supporting Karen anymore. She had been completely exposed. After the HOA meeting ended, Karen couldn't accept defeat. Not only had she lost her power within the HOA council, but she had also been exposed in front of the entire neighborhood for the manipulation and corruption she had hidden for years. But instead of accepting her loss, Karen decided to play her final card, suing Michael for abusing power by buying up properties in the neighborhood. Karen claimed that I had used my company name to seize control of the neighborhood's properties in order to take over the HOA, and that my actions violated HOA regulations. In her lawsuit, she stated that I violated the legal rights of other residents and interfered with the free development of the community. Karen's lawsuit was sent to court along with a long list of accusations, but it was clear this was just a ploy to blame me and avoid taking personal responsibility. While facing the lawsuit, I had already prepared. Everything Karen had done, everything she had done wrong over the years, I had strong evidence to protect my rights. My lawyer, John Matthews, and I had prepared irrefutable evidence to counter Karen's lawsuit. When we walked into the courtroom, I felt more calm than ever. I knew this lawsuit would be the opportunity to expose the whole truth about Karen. We started presenting the evidence. The HOA's financial records, clearly showing how Karen had used the HOA's funds for her personal benefit. Unreasonable expenses like her trip to Maui, lavish parties for the HOA board members, were all clearly documented. We also provided a video from a previous HOA meeting where Karen deliberately manipulated the rules to benefit herself and make life difficult for residents who disagreed with her. Evidence from residents proving that Karen had abused her power to force people to comply with unreasonable rules, such as the 2-car parking limit, fines for violations regarding flower colors and sizes, and even spying on residents at night to catch any small infractions. John Matthews, my lawyer, not only used the financial evidence, but also presented copies of internal HOA emails, where Karen ordered board members to support her decisions, regardless of residents' objections. Every one of Karen's actions had been meticulously documented, from unjust investigations to threatening demands against those who didn't comply. However, the most powerful blows didn't come from me or my lawyer. Former HOA board members came forward, testifying against Karen for the abuse of power and manipulation they had witnessed during their time working with her. Mr. George Reynolds, a former HOA board member, stood up and confirmed that Karen had pressured him to approve unfair rules, including banning families with children from playing outside at certain hours to maintain order in the neighborhood. Ms. Linda Foster, a former HOA accountant, also testified about how Karen had used HOA funds for her personal trips and even paid her family members under false job titles. Mr. Daniel Briggs, another former board member, stated that Karen had bullied and threatened him when he opposed imposing harsh regulations on residents, including fining families for temporarily parking incorrectly during a snowstorm. The testimony from the former board members made the atmosphere in the courtroom even more tense. Karen began to show signs of panic, trying to interrupt the witnesses, but this only made everyone in the room realize the truth more clearly than ever. Karen had no hope left. Her lawyer looked exhausted, facing the clear evidence and strong condemnation from the witnesses. After all the evidence was presented, the court couldn't ignore the truth. Karen, who had thought she would come out on top, was now completely exposed. The court ruled to dismiss Karen's lawsuit because there was no legal basis for her claims. Furthermore, the court ordered a full investigation into the HOA's finances to review all the expenditures Karen had made during her time managing the board. Karen not only failed to win the lawsuit, but she was also ordered to repay the money she had embezzled from the HOA's funds, a sum reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was the price she had to pay for the abuse of power she had carried out for so many years. The feeling of satisfaction and contentment surged within me as I watched Karen being held accountable in the way she deserved. All of her manipulation and power abuse had been exposed, and now she had to face the inevitable consequences. When the truth was revealed, justice finally spoke, and Karen could not escape the consequences. After the trial, Karen no longer had any power. The entire neighborhood, those who had endured her oppression and tyrannical attitude for years, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But justice wasn't just about removing Karen. It was about restructuring the HOA so that the community could truly thrive in a fair and equal environment. Immediately after Karen resigned as HOA president, the residents organized a vote to elect a new board. The vote took place in an atmosphere full of excitement and hope, as everyone understood that this was their chance to rebuild the community, to restore the values that the HOA was truly supposed to stand for. The result was the formation of a new board, made up of residents who had previously suffered under Karen's rule, all of whom were committed to working for the collective good of the neighborhood. Unreasonable rules, which were only meant to control and punish, were now completely abolished. Gone were the illogical rules about tree colors, the unfair fines for having too many cars in the driveway, and the strict regulations on mailbox designs. Instead, fairer rules replaced them. Every resident could park in their driveway without fear of fines, gardens could grow freely as long as they didn't affect the community, and the HOA's financial system was now used transparently to improve the neighborhood. The HOA fees were no longer used for Karen's vacation trips or her lavish parties. Every dollar collected was now being used to improve the neighborhood, from upgrading the playground for the kids to repairing the old pool that Karen had left to deteriorate. The community began to see real changes, meaningful changes that created a better living space for all residents. With the complete collapse of her power, Karen had no place in the neighborhood anymore. Unable to bear losing control, she decided to sell her house and leave, hoping to find a new place where she could continue to reign and manipulate. But karma never forgets those who abuse power. When Karen moved to a new neighborhood, thinking things would be easier, irony struck. In her new neighborhood, Karen couldn't escape her old habit, violating parking regulations. And once again, Karen had to face another HOA, not one she controlled, but a fair board that refused to succumb to her manipulation. Karen was fined for violating parking rules in her new neighborhood, a fine she had previously imposed on residents in her old neighborhood. A perfect karma, like a debt she had to pay. No one in her new neighborhood cared about Karen's past power because now she was just a person being punished for her own wrongdoings. And as I watched Karen drive away from our old neighborhood, with a look of embarrassment and disappointment, I felt a wave of satisfaction. It was the deserved end for those who abuse power. Karen had been defeated not only legally but also in the hearts of the neighborhood residents, those who had suffered too long under her iron hand. The deep lesson here: when you abuse power and manipulate others for personal gain, eventually you will face the consequences. Arrogance and greed always lead to failure because no one can rely on fear and oppression forever. True power must come from respect and serving the community, not from hurting others to achieve personal goals. Justice never sleeps. The truth will always prevail, and those who abuse power will be punished accordingly. This story is proof that sometimes karma is the greatest lesson. Now, with Karen no longer in the picture, our neighborhood has become a place where people respect one another, where justice is properly enforced, and where every resident can live freely without the fear of oppression from power-hungry individuals. The conclusion of this story brings a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment, knowing that the villain has finally received what they truly deserved. If you have any suggestions to add to this story or any edits you'd like to make, don't hesitate to let me know. In today's story, Mark Davis, a skilled lawyer, faces off against Karen Miller, the HOA president, who tries to use her power to stop Mark's vegetable garden. But she's in for a surprise. Mark isn't just any resident. He's a lawyer with the legal knowledge to fight back. As tensions rise, Mark uses his expertise to challenge the HOA's unreasonable actions, and the entire community stands by his side. This isn't just about a garden. It's a fight for justice and the rights of individuals. What do you think about HOA rules and their power? What would you do in Mark's situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to watch until the end to see how this thrilling story unfolds. You won't want to miss it. I am Mark Davis, a lawyer who has dedicated 25 years to working in the office, facing long hours of stressful work, lawsuits, and never-ending calls. My life was full of pressure and tension. One day, I realized I couldn't continue living this way, and I needed to find a way to relax and regain peace in my life. So, I decided to make a change. I started planting vegetables in my backyard. On weekends, I immersed myself in gardening, planting rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and other organic vegetables that I took care of with my own hands. It was the place where I found tranquility, the only space without the sound of ringing phones, papers, or lawsuits to handle. For me, tending to the garden was the only way to escape the pressures of work and to find peace of mind. However, I never expected that this peaceful life would soon be interrupted by someone I never wanted to meet, Karen Miller, the president of the HOA in our neighborhood. Karen could turn a normal day into chaos within minutes with her utterly unreasonable arguments. One morning, I still remember it was a Saturday, I was standing in the garden, my hands covered in soil after planting a row of tomatoes. The feeling of soft soil under my hands always gave me a wonderful sense of relaxation, but that peace was quickly interrupted when Karen Miller appeared. She had a perfect appearance, from her carefully styled hair to her outfit, which was always meticulously chosen, with not a single thread out of place. Karen walked over with a displeased look, arms crossed, her posture like someone ready to uncover a serious crime. "Mark, I need to talk to you," she began, her tone stern as if she were about to read an indictment. "Growing vegetables in your front yard like this is completely unacceptable." I looked at her, surprised and a little confused. "How is this unacceptable, Karen?" "I'm just growing a few vegetables," I replied, not knowing whether to laugh or be angry. Karen, impatient, gestured toward my garden. "This is not a garden that beautifies the neighborhood. This is a mess." According to HOA regulations, all front yards in Willow Creek estates must be landscaped according to a specific standard. And vegetables? They should only be in the backyard, out of sight from the front. I stood there, completely unable to comprehend. What about flowers? They're plants too, and no one complains about them. But vegetables are banned? Don't you see how illogical this is? Karen didn't bother explaining, just shook her head and pulled out her phone. "I'll take pictures of this and report it to the HOA. You'll receive a violation notice tomorrow morning." She was ready to ruin my joy just because of a small vegetable garden with no reasonable justification behind any of these rules. I couldn't help but wonder, is there anyone besides Karen who really believes that a vegetable garden could be such a big issue? I just smiled lightly, feeling like I was participating in a pointless conversation. "Karen, I think you need to review the HOA regulations again. I've lived here long before the HOA existed. And about the rules, I have exemptions in the property sale agreement." Karen heard that but was unfazed. She just shook her head and looked at me like I was talking nonsense. "That doesn't matter," Karen coldly replied, not paying attention to anything I said. "I'll take you to the HOA board, and I'm sure there will be a clear ruling on this issue." I stood there, feeling like I was being pushed into a game I never agreed to play. I knew my rights, but Karen didn't want to listen. She was too used to imposing unreasonable rules and making the neighborhood residents fearful, forcing them to comply with unfounded demands. "Karen," I said, trying to stay calm, "I understand you want to do everything by the book, but do you even realize if the rule you're applying is reasonable? My vegetable garden doesn't harm anyone. No one is affected by it. I grow vegetables for my family to eat, not to disrupt the neighborhood." Karen looked at me as though I were saying something absurd. "No one is saying you can't grow vegetables, Mark," she said, but suddenly pointed at my garden. "I'm just saying it can't be here, right in the front yard. If you want to grow vegetables, move them to the back, out of sight from everyone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So if I grow flowers or ornamental plants here, will they be acceptable?" I asked, feeling like I was stepping into an absurd, unscripted comedy. Karen didn't answer right away, just shook her head. She hurriedly pulled out her phone and scrolled the screen as if she had everything prepared. "I will report this to the HOA immediately. You will receive a violation notice tomorrow morning. And don't think you can escape this ruling." Watching her furiously take notes, I could only sigh. To me, this seemed like a joke. I had lived here long before the HOA came into existence. Back then, the neighborhood was a friendly community where everyone respected each other. But since Karen took charge, everything changed. She didn't just run the HOA, she wanted to control every tiny aspect of people's lives. "Karen," I said, calmly, "I'm not going down easily. You can take me to the HOA, but don't forget that I have rights clearly stated in the property sale agreement. If you want to go to court, I'm ready." Karen shook her head, took a deep breath, and looked at me as though I had just done something foolish. "Get ready, Mark. You can't win against us." The next day, when I returned from the office, I saw a violation notice pasted on my door. It was a bright orange sheet of paper, the kind you usually see when something serious happens. I opened the paper and couldn't believe my eyes. $53 per day for illegal agricultural activities in my front yard. This amount wasn't small, especially since all I wanted was to grow a few vegetables for my family. I stood there, staring at the fine, then shook my head and chuckled to myself. Why is HOA fining me for growing vegetables? $53 a day, how many vegetables do I need to sell just to pay for this fine? I wondered, feeling a bit frustrated, but also unable to help but find it somewhat humorous. So many people in the neighborhood grow flowers and ornamental plants without anyone complaining, but I plant a small vegetable garden and I get fined? It just didn't make sense. So, I began noting everything down in a small notebook. April 13th, 2025, violation notice with a fine of $53 per day. I could feel the absurdity growing inside me. But what I didn't expect was that this was just the beginning. On the morning of April 15th, I woke up early, hoping for a peaceful day as usual. But when I opened the door and stepped outside, I couldn't believe my eyes. 3 giant bulldozers were blocking the driveway to my house. I stood frozen, my eyes wide, unable to understand what was happening. The bulldozers stood there like metal monsters, blocking the way and preventing me from driving out. And, of course, standing beside the bulldozers was Karen Miller, with a triumphant look on her face and the confidence as if she had won a great battle. Beside her was David Smith, the HOA lawyer, standing there like an emotionless machine, not showing any sign of discomfort at the situation. Mark, Karen started, her voice filled with self-satisfaction. We will immediately remove these violating structures. She pointed at my vegetable garden, looking at me as if I were committing a serious crime. I stood there, trying to remain calm, though inside I was seething. I'm just growing a few tomatoes, not building an amusement park, I replied, trying to keep my tone gentle, but I was far from peaceful inside. The 3 bulldozers blocked my driveway, and I didn't know what to do. What I was certain of at that moment was that things had gone too far. The frustration surged inside me, but I knew I had to stay firm. This wasn't a small matter anymore. $53 a day was already a burden, but now they were using 3 bulldozers to destroy my hard work and my joy. I couldn't let them continue like this. The frustration became unbearable as I looked at the 3 massive bulldozers blocking my driveway. The entrance to my house was completely blocked, and I stood there, unable to believe my eyes. I am a lawyer, I understand rights and legal matters, and I knew Karen Miller and David Smith's actions were a serious violation. But I wouldn't let anger control me. Karen, David, I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm, we need to talk about rights and the law. You think bringing 3 bulldozers here will just get rid of my vegetable garden? Do you really understand the law here? Karen looked at me, unwavering, as though she had anticipated this reaction from me. Mark, do you still not understand? This is HOA policy, and I'm carrying out my duties. I raised an eyebrow and stared directly at her. Karen, you're talking about HOA policy, but do you know that I've lived here long before HOA existed? My property rights go back before HOA, and I'm exempt according to the terms of the land sale agreement. You can't apply HOA rules to me. Karen, although slightly unsettled, still held her ground. But we have a decision from the HOA board. These violations need to be addressed. I took a deep breath, then pulled out a small notebook, flipped to a page, and pointed to the clauses in my contract. According to Clause 6, Section 3 of the land sale agreement my family signed in 1973, my property is completely exempt from any HOA regulations, including planning rules. This was part of the agreement with the developers before HOA even existed. If you want to dispute this, I'm ready to take it to court. Karen looked at the document I handed her, but immediately turned away, still confident in her stance. Anyway, I've already received instructions from the HOA board. You can take these documents to court if you want. Karen, do you really understand the law? I asked, my tone calm but tinged with sarcasm. I'm a lawyer, and I know that HOA has no right to enforce these rules on me, especially with a clear exemption in the contract. You can't intimidate me with these unreasonable decisions. And if necessary, I'll take all of this to court to ensure my rights are protected. After the intense confrontation with Karen Miller and David Smith, I decided I couldn't just stand by and wait for the situation to pass. As a lawyer, I knew that in a legal situation like this, I needed clear and specific evidence. Not only would this help protect my personal rights, but it would also help the other residents in the neighborhood realize the abuse of power by the HOA. The next day, I began digging through old records that my family had kept for years. These documents related to the land sale that my family made in 1973 to the Willow Creek Estates Development Company. After an hour of tense searching through old filing cabinets, I found the original land sale agreement. I carefully flipped through each page, and my eyes stopped at Clause 6, Section 3 of the contract, which clearly stated, exemption from HOA regulations for family households, including the right to freely use and develop the land without being bound by any future HOA rules. At that moment, when I looked at the clearly written words in the agreement, I knew I had the most important weapon in my hands. My family was not bound by HOA regulations, and if necessary, I would take all these documents to court. Not only that, I also found a copy of the land ownership certificate issued by the County Land Management Agency in 1973, confirming my family's ownership of the land before the HOA even existed. This certificate clearly stated that the entire property I live on had retained ownership rights and exemptions from any external organizations, including regulations and impositions from the HOA. With these crucial documents in hand, I decided to immediately contact Sheriff Turner and Helen Green to inform them about the new discoveries. Helen, a longtime family friend, had helped me with legal matters before. After reviewing the documents I provided, Helen immediately agreed with my plan. She said, "Mark, I think it's time we bring this to light. We need to show Karen and the HOA that they don't have the right to act this way." The next day, I took all the documents to the county finance department to verify the information about the money the HOA had collected from residents in the area. This agency provided me with a detailed statement of HOA's income over the past year, showing that more than $150,000 had been collected annually from residents. But there had been no improvement projects or renovations done in the neighborhood. This clearly showed that the HOA had been collecting money without providing any benefit to the community. Furthermore, this money had been transferred into the account of a private company called Willow Creek Holdings LLC, which I found out was co-owned by both Karen Miller and David Smith. The evidence of clear corruption helped me face the threats of Karen and David. I not only had my legal rights but also solid evidence of their abuse of power. After I had gathered all the legal documents and undeniable evidence, I decided to call David Smith, the HOA lawyer, to request a meeting and discuss the matter. When the call ended, the atmosphere became tenser than ever. I knew I couldn't always rely on emotions to handle the situation, so I tried to stay calm and be clear about everything. "David, I've sent you documents regarding my rights. These documents not only prove my ownership but also provide clear evidence that the HOA has collected money from residents without completing any projects. This can no longer be overlooked. You should prepare yourself to explain the funds that the HOA has taken from residents in this area." There was a moment of silence on the other end. I could feel the tension and anxiety in David's voice. "Mark, we won't be able to discuss these documents right now. However, I promise I will review everything." I could sense the weakness in David's voice, which was a stark contrast to the confident tone he had before. He knew he was facing a much bigger issue than he had imagined. The next day, I received another call, this time from Karen Miller. I wasn't surprised to see her name on the phone screen, but her tone truly caught my attention. It was no longer triumphant, but instead filled with worry and uncertainty. "Mark, I think we need to sit down and discuss this. But we can't continue like this. I'll have to work with the HOA board again," she said, her voice faltering and lacking confidence. I could almost imagine the look on Karen's face, no longer the tough, self-assured attitude. She had realized that when confronted with irrefutable evidence, all her threats were meaningless. Both the HOA and Karen had lost control of the situation. "So now you're starting to understand, Karen," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "Remember, I'm not just defending my vegetable garden. This isn't just a personal battle, it's about the rights of all the residents in this neighborhood. If you don't want to face serious consequences, I suggest you reconsider your decision before it's too late." The change in Karen's tone clearly showed that she was starting to feel anxious. The HOA's decisions were reaching an impasse, and this time, she couldn't use her power to impose anything on me like before. The helplessness was evident in her words as she tried to find a way to back out. "Mark, I understand now," Karen stammered. "We will meet soon and discuss how to resolve this. We'll work with the HOA board." After the call from Karen Miller, I no longer felt threatened by the HOA. In fact, I realized that I was standing on solid ground. I had my legal rights and the support of the community. This was not just about a vegetable garden, but about fairness for all the residents in this neighborhood. I couldn't let the HOA continue to abuse their power without facing real opposition. So, I decided to organize an emergency meeting with all the residents of the neighborhood to publicly share the documents I had found and clearly explain the issues that the HOA was trying to impose on us. Helen Green, a longtime family friend, immediately agreed to help me organize the meeting. We decided to hold it at the community hall, where all the residents could attend. On that day, I prepared the legal documents, including the land sale contract, ownership certificate, and the HOA's income statement. I knew I had to convince everyone that it wasn't just me. We all had the right to be protected from these unreasonable regulations and the abuse of power by the HOA. When the meeting began, about 30 residents showed up. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but there was also a sense of eagerness. I could feel the change in people's attitudes. They no longer wanted to remain silent and accept these unreasonable conditions. Thank you all for coming. Today, I want to share with you some important documents. I began, my voice confident. These documents will prove that the HOA has no right to impose regulations on my family. And in fact, they've collected hundreds of thousands of dollars without completing any projects for the neighborhood. This not only violates my rights, but is an abuse of power against all of us. I continued presenting the documents, pointing out the figures and evidence I had gathered. Some people started shaking their heads, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. Mr. Jenkins, a longtime resident, was the first to speak up. "Mark, I've suspected the HOA for a long time. They keep taking our money for projects we never see, and now you've made it all clear. I support you." Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman in the corner of the room, couldn't contain her frustration either. "I've been fined for things that had nothing to do with me, just because I forgot to repaint my mailbox to match the approved color. Now I see I'm not alone. Thank you, Mark, for standing up for all of us." These words made me feel a strong sense of empathy. I realized that this fight was not just mine. The HOA wasn't only violating my rights, but also those of many other residents in the neighborhood. Another resident, Mr. Johnson, stood up and said, "No one wants to live under the rule of an organization like this HOA. We need to create a community where people can freely do what they want within the law." His statement completely changed the mood in the room. The residents began discussing passionately about creating a new residents group to replace the HOA and implement fairer and more transparent rules. They were no longer afraid. They realized they could stand up against this oppression. A woman in the group spoke up. "We can't keep letting the HOA control everything. I support creating a new residents group where we can all decide what's best for the community, not let a few people at the board decide for us." The community started to unite, and the idea of forming a new residents group to replace the HOA was increasingly supported. Lively discussions took place, and everyone felt a common goal: to create a fairer living environment for all. In the end, everything came to a close. Not just I, but all the residents of Willow Creek Estates stood together to fight against Karen Miller and David Smith. This long struggle wasn't just about a small vegetable garden, but about the rights of everyone in this neighborhood. And with clear evidence and the unity of the community, we made Karen and her allies face consequences they couldn't deny. After I provided all the documents and evidence to the county police department and the district attorney's office, everything started to move quickly. The corruption and embezzlement of funds by Karen and David were undeniable. Investigations revealed that over $300,000 had been completely misappropriated by Karen and David through the collection of unjust fees from neighborhood residents without any actual projects or renovations being carried out. Furthermore, we discovered that Willow Creek Holdings LLC, the company where both Karen and David were major shareholders, had received a large portion of the funds collected from these fees, which were completely unrelated to HOA activities. This was not only an ethical violation, but also a serious criminal act. The police arrested Karen Miller and David Smith on June 1st, shortly after the evidence was publicly released. Just hours after their arrest, news of the case spread rapidly throughout the neighborhood. The residents of Willow Creek Estates began gathering at the community hall to celebrate the victory. They had not only won a legal battle, but also secured a victory for justice and transparency within the community. Immediately after the HOA was dissolved, we began to rebuild a true community of our own. The unreasonable regulations of the HOA were eliminated, and a new group of residents was formed to replace the old management system. Everyone in the neighborhood was involved in this process. We decided to establish a new community management system where everyone had a voice, and no one had to fear exercising their legal rights. In the end, Karen not only lost her position of power but also faced investigation for her corrupt actions. After her arrest, the entire community felt like a weight had been lifted. David Smith also didn't escape punishment, as he was forced to face charges of embezzlement and fraud. Everything ended with the burial of the HOA, an organization that once claimed the right to control everything but lacked transparency and fairness. With the dissolution of the HOA, one of the first things the residents decided to do was take care of the community garden. Previously, Karen had deemed the garden unsightly and ordered the removal of all plants, flowers, and areas she deemed unsuitable for HOA standards. She even fined nearby residents for planting non-compliant plants. But now, the garden was no longer suppressed by unreasonable regulations. Helen Green, Mr. Jenkins, and I, along with other neighbors, rolled up our sleeves to tend to the garden. We replanted flowers, vegetables, and ornamental plants that Karen had previously removed. This wasn't just about taking care of the land, but an act symbolizing the restoration and unity within the community. We also decided to organize community events to keep the garden a place where everyone could meet, relax, and share stories. Every weekend, the whole neighborhood would gather in the garden to tend to the plants, host barbecue parties, or simply enjoy an afternoon relaxing under the shade of the trees. We even planned to build a clean vegetable garden in the area, where every resident could grow vegetables and share them with each other. Once again, the garden became a symbol of inclusion, collaboration, and community bonding. Everyone was free to do what they liked within the legal framework, and no one had to fear unreasonable decisions like before. Karen Miller and David Smith not only lost their power but also faced serious charges. Karen was convicted of corruption and embezzlement for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the residents, while David was charged with fraud and working with Karen to falsify the HOA's financial reports. Both of them faced prison sentences and were required to repay the money they had stolen. As the story reaches its climax, Mark's unwavering determination and legal expertise lead to a shocking victory. Karen Miller and David Smith are finally held accountable for their corrupt actions, and the HOA is dismantled. The community comes together to rebuild not only a garden, but also the foundation of a fair and transparent neighborhood system. What began as a small dispute has turned into a powerful reminder that standing up for justice can change an entire community. But the story doesn't end here. It's a testament to what happens when we take control of our rights and refuse to accept injustice. What do you think? Do you believe more communities should stand up like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring content like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge the status quo and bring real change. Welcome to a story that is not only shocking but also reflects some of the most pressing social and legal issues. This is the story of abuse of power, about how a woman, Karen Bradley, the president of the HOA, used her power to oppress and manipulate an entire community, leading to unforeseen consequences. But can power always win over justice? Will the abusers pay the price when the truth is exposed? Join me as we follow this dramatic story, where the tension begins at a funeral, a sacred event that quickly turns into an unrelenting legal battle. Ethan Harris, a man grieving the loss of his loved one, becomes the victim of an unbelievable injustice, arrested by the HOA president without a valid reason. However, what Karen didn't expect was that the person she was trying to silence was none other than the son of one of the most powerful figures in America, Mark Harris, the U.S. Attorney General. Throughout the story, evidence gradually unfolds, and everyone, from the neighborhood community to the media, can't stop commenting on Karen's actions. But when things escalate to a climax, the truth will prevail and justice will be served. So, can Karen escape the charges she faces? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the full story. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the power and responsibilities of organizations like the HOA? Have you ever witnessed similar abuse of power in your community? We'd love to read your perspectives. Make sure to watch until the end of this surprising story. Each step the characters take will keep you on the edge of your seat. October 5th, 2022, Ethan Harris and I, Mark Harris, stood in the cemetery, enduring the pain of losing my son, Christopher Harris. It was a drizzly day, the cold air making the loss even heavier. Despite the rain, my family was determined to hold the funeral for Christopher, our beloved eldest son, in the quiet surroundings of the cemetery. The pain of loss is something that no one can prepare for. I, Mark Harris, stood next to my son, Ethan, in a gloomy cemetery. The cold ground beneath my feet, the sound of the shovel gently tapping the layers of earth, served as a reminder that life and death are inevitable. But today, in this moment, I felt a pain not from the loss of my son, but from the absence of a brother, a friend. Ethan, my only remaining son, stood next to me, gripping my hand tightly, his eyes fixed on the casket being slowly lowered into the ground. I knew my son was struggling with emotions I couldn't fully grasp. The pain in Ethan's eyes wasn't just loss, but a deep, unspoken anger. He didn't say anything, remained silent, but I knew that his pain was no less than mine. It's hard to express the feeling of standing there, watching someone you love leave this world, unable to stop time or change anything. Every breath I took, every step I made, carried a weight of pain that words couldn't describe. At that moment, there was nothing but silence, just Ethan and me, together immersed in the profound loss. Everything around me seemed to stop. The footsteps of those around us, the soft breeze rustling through the trees, all faded and blurred. The only thing in focus was the shiny black casket lying between white cloths, half hidden in a space overwhelmed by silence. A space I couldn't escape from, no matter how much I wanted to. I looked at the casket, at the polished wooden lid, where the name Christopher Harris was engraved in gold, and my heart felt torn apart. Ethan stood next to me, his hands clenched tightly, his knuckles turning white. He didn't speak, but I could feel the pain seeping through every nerve of his body. His eyes were fixed on the casket, tears in them, but he didn't cry. This pain left no room for tears, only an immense emptiness, swallowing all remaining emotions. As the casket was slowly lowered, I felt the movement of time. Each rope resting on the casket was like a goodbye, a final farewell I couldn't express. The sound of the rope tightening, the heavy chains clinking, each noise seemed to echo like the beat of my heart, slowly sinking into a pit. The cold from the earth started to creep into my shoes, reminding me that beneath my feet was another world, one where no one can return. The casket hit the bottom gently, but with a weight that seemed to press the world into that moment. The smell of damp earth, the heavy scent of separation, made it hard for me to breathe. This feeling wasn't physical pain. It was the overwhelming weight of a loss that could never be compensated. I turned to look at Ethan. He was no longer the child I knew. His face, with eyes burning with pain, had now become withered, as though a part of his soul had died along with his brother. Tears still wouldn't fall, and I could feel the exhaustion in each of his breaths. The moment when the casket touched the earth, when all sound drowned into silence, I couldn't speak. The world seemed to blur. I wanted to say something, to find a comforting word for my son, but I too was overwhelmed with an emptiness that couldn't be filled. The people around us slowly began to retreat, and raindrops began to fall. A part of me wanted to hold on to this moment, to remember my son, but I knew that nothing lasts forever. No one can live forever in the past, and now, we had to continue living with the absence of the one we loved most. As the raindrops started falling softly on my and Ethan's coats, the air became unusually still, as if time had stopped. But that moment, filled with sorrow, was shattered by the appearance of Karen Bradley. Her elegant beige coat, meticulously crafted with sharp seams, Karen walked into the cemetery as if she were attending an important meeting. She paid no attention to the surrounding environment, instead seemingly looking for an opportunity to assert her power. Karen's steps were filled with confidence, each footfall echoing as though to affirm her role as the leader, the one who had the authority to decide everything in this area. Her hair, neatly styled and dyed a shiny blonde, acted like a delicate crown, making her stand out even more in this gloomy setting. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It also represented her self-importance, a clear sign of her desire for control. Karen's eyes, sharp like a razor, scanned the crowd, offering no empathy. Her gaze wasn't for our grief, but rather searching for an opportunity to fulfill a task she believed was her right to execute. An unsettling feeling grew within me as I watched Karen's presence. She wasn't here to share in our sorrow. She was here to cause trouble, like an intruder into our family's pain. Every step she took, every shrug of her shoulders, seemed like a proclamation of superiority in the eyes of those around her. And then, something I never expected happened. She stopped, facing Ethan and me, her gaze emotionless. In the heavy silence, Karen pointed directly at Ethan. "That's him. He's trespassing." Her voice rang out, clear and powerful, as if commanding a hunt. Everyone around us froze, turning to look, as if awaiting an important decision. I turned to look at Ethan, and saw him staring up at Karen, his eyes no longer filled with surprise but with an anger that could no longer be contained. "He doesn't live here anymore," Karen continued, her tone growing sharper, as if she needed to assert that Ethan had no right to be there. "He's a trespasser. Arrest him." That statement was like a slap to my face. Its absurdity made everything around me feel as if time slowed down. This scene was like a play with no script, where she, as the HOA president, had turned a family's funeral into a trespassing event of a member she claimed no longer fell under her control. I stared at Karen, unable to believe what I had just heard. She stood there, not feeling the weight of the moment, but rather seeming satisfied with the control she had. Despite the pain tearing at my heart, I could still clearly sense the injustice. Karen wasn't just hurting my family, she was abusing her power to commit an irrational act, all because of an HOA regulation that only she seemed to understand. Karen stood there, her expression unmoved, arms crossed over her chest, as if carrying out a final judgment. She stared at Ethan, her gaze cold and without a hint of sympathy. I could feel the silence of the entire cemetery being torn apart by her words. "Arrest him," Karen ordered, her voice full of authority, as if arresting my son were a trivial matter. "He doesn't live here anymore. He has no right to be here." "Officer." The entire cemetery was immersed in stunned silence. Those around us, the witnesses to this scene, couldn't believe their eyes. They looked at each other, hesitant, then turned their gaze toward us. The officers stood still, seemingly waiting for Karen's command, without hesitation. Ethan immediately reacted, his eyes red from anger. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice firm and full of rage. "Are you going to arrest me for some stupid rule?" He stepped forward, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What the hell are you doing? This is a funeral, not a HOA meeting. What right do you have to interfere in my family's affairs?" Karen didn't say a word, just stood there with a cold expression, not caring about Ethan's words. She turned to the two officers as if everything had been decided in advance. "Do it now," she ordered without hesitation. "There's nothing to discuss here. Arrest him." I stood there, unable to speak. My heart felt like it had stopped, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't let Ethan suffer this absurdity, but I also understood that this was an opportunity one couldn't miss. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Ethan, don't resist," I spoke, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "Let her do it." Ethan turned to look at me, his face full of surprise and confusion. "Dad, what are you saying? Why should I let her do this to me? We can't let her arrest me." "We can't do anything right now, Ethan," I said, my hand tightly balled into a fist. "Let her arrest you. This is not the time for direct confrontation. What's important is that we get evidence. She won't get away with this." Ethan still didn't understand, and his anger only grew stronger. "Dad, do you want me to get arrested? You can't do anything." I placed my hand on my son's shoulder, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I was boiling inside. "It's not that I'm doing nothing, Ethan. I'm doing something much bigger. This will be the evidence we need to expose Karen and her abuse of power. Let her act like this, and we will take everything back." Ethan looked at me for a long while, as if still not believing what I was saying. But in the end, he nodded, his eyes still filled with rage. He didn't fully understand the whole picture, but he trusted me. The officers approached, one trying to grab Ethan's arm. Ethan flinched, but didn't resist as strongly anymore. He wouldn't stand still, but he didn't fight back like he did before. The officer pressed in, trying to tighten his grip on Ethan's arm. "You can't do this," Ethan shouted, but this time his voice was weaker, no longer as resolute. The officers continued to pull him away, but there was a noticeable hesitation on their faces. They knew this was a bizarre situation, and they weren't sure what was right or wrong in this case. However, they still followed Karen's orders, and I knew there would be a price to pay for this. The entire cemetery held its breath as the officers led Ethan out of the crowd, taking him to the patrol car. The people around us silently watched, and in that silence, I could feel the tension hanging in the air, as if each of them knew this was wrong but dared not speak up. I stood there, overwhelmed with anger and disappointment. but I also knew that I was doing the right thing. Karen's abuse of power wouldn't last long, and the evidence gathered today would be the final blow to expose her. I couldn't speak immediately, as the shock and anger surged within me too quickly. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Karen had crossed the line. The boundary between power and absurdity had been erased, and I knew I wouldn't let this go easily. Being at the cemetery earlier was a shock to my family, but I knew that to achieve justice, I had to remain calm and not act out of emotion. All I could do at that moment was watch my son being dragged away, while I silently waited for the right time. After a while, when the police car carrying Ethan had left, I knew it was time for me to intervene. Karen Bradley was not a woman who easily forgave, especially when her pride and power were challenged. And that was exactly what Ethan had done when he was still a teenager. In an HOA meeting, where the neighborhood residents gathered to discuss community issues, Ethan had stood up and spoken the truth that few dared to acknowledge. When Karen was speaking about a neighborhood security issue, Ethan noticed something that everyone around him was deliberately ignoring. Karen had been discriminating against certain youth groups in the neighborhood. Ethan, a young man brave enough to speak out about things adults often avoid, criticized Karen right in the meeting. He pointed out that Karen had no problem with white youth gathering in the park at night, but she treated black youth very harshly. He also emphasized that for Karen, there was a clear double standard for the neighborhood residents, those she deemed acceptable, and those who didn't fit the mold she had set. Ethan's words made Karen furious. She couldn't accept being criticized by a child who dared to challenge her authority in the community meeting. For Karen, her power was not something that could be questioned. Ethan not only dared to speak up, but also to point out the injustice in her management right in front of the other residents, which deeply wounded Karen's pride. She couldn't forgive being exposed by a teenager, and this led to a long-standing animosity. From then on, Karen began to view Ethan as an enemy. Every time she saw Ethan, the hostility in her eyes flared up again. She would always remember that moment, never forgetting that a child had made her feel embarrassed and disrespected in front of others. This hatred grew stronger, following her in every decision she made about the neighborhood, from strict regulations to her differential treatment of the residents. This hatred only intensified as Ethan grew older. When Ethan returned to the neighborhood for his brother's funeral, Karen not only saw a grieving son mourning his loved one, but she saw an opportunity for revenge. This wasn't just about the violation of a funeral. It was about the challenge to Karen's power from the very beginning. That's why Karen couldn't let this opportunity slip by. For her, arresting Ethan wasn't just about an HOA rule, but about getting her revenge for the offense Ethan caused when he dared to expose truths Karen never wanted to face. I'm not a man who lets injustice slide, but I also understood that right now, I had to show calm. I looked around, feeling every heavy step as I walked into the police station. Each footstep echoed clearly on the cold tile floor, a reminder of my determination. Now, I was no longer the father in pain watching his son being arrested, but the U.S. Attorney General, a person with the power and responsibility to uphold justice. The door to the police station closed behind me with a sharp click. The air in the room became stifling. The officer at the desk didn't look up when I entered, but I didn't care about their indifference. I walked straight to the counter, my hand steady as I pulled out my black leather wallet. In a flash, I opened the wallet, flipped out my U.S. Attorney General card, and placed it on the desk. Immediately, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The officer at the desk stared at the card, his face turning pale in an instant. A tense silence enveloped the entire room. Every sound seemed to be muffled. It felt as though no one in the room could speak, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, like the warning bell of a legal battle about to begin. The officer looked up at me, but didn't dare speak. His hands trembled slightly, and I could feel the fear in his eyes. After a brief moment of silence, I knew exactly what I needed to say. "Release my son immediately," I said, my voice as cold as ice, without a hint of hesitation. This wasn't a request, it was an order. The officer no longer had the same confidence when he looked at me. He lowered his gaze to the card once more, his lips moving as if trying to respond, but he couldn't. I knew right then that he understood he couldn't refuse me. This was a battle he couldn't win, not in this context, not when I was the U.S. Attorney General. Just seconds later, another officer from the adjacent room entered, but he also didn't dare speak. They only looked at each other silently, clearly knowing they couldn't disobey my orders. The tension in the air remained, but everything had already been decided. The officer at the desk, after a long moment of staring at my card, stood up and began to walk toward the holding cells. Resolve this now, to avoid bigger trouble. I added again, my tone still sharp and full of authority. The room was silent. No one dared argue. And finally, the officer nodded hesitantly before ordering Ethan's immediate release. The situation at the cemetery was temporarily resolved and Ethan was released. The public and media reaction came swiftly and powerfully. Journalists who were on the scene immediately began reporting on Karen Bradley, the HOA president, ordering the arrest of Ethan during his brother's funeral. This shocking story quickly spread across major media platforms, with headlines appearing in newspapers such as HOA president arrests attendee at his own brother's funeral and funeral turns into nightmare. Karen Bradley abuses power to arrest grieving family member. Within 24 hours, the story appeared on CNN, NBC News, and many other major television networks. Journalists did not hesitate to criticize Karen's actions, emphasizing the absurdity and inhumanity of her decision. A New York Times article wrote, "Nothing can justify the arrest of a person attending his own brother's funeral. This is an unacceptable abuse of power in any society." The public's reaction on social media was almost immediate, with the hashtag Karen the Tyrant quickly appearing on Twitter, reaching over 1 million tweets within 72 hours. Sarcastic and mocking comments flooded in. Is she a cop or the president? Who gave her the right to abuse her power like that? Karen, the HOA protector, turned a funeral into a legal battle. She should have handed over her power because she has completely abused it. Social media not only criticized Karen for her actions but also mocked her ignorance of the situation, turning her from a person of power into a subject of ridicule. Memes mocking Karen's self-satisfied expression in front of the camera while everyone knew the truth about her wrongful actions spread quickly. Notably, human rights organizations like the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, immediately called for an investigation into Karen's conduct. They described it as a serious abuse of power and violation of personal liberties and demanded a public investigation. Karen continued to defend herself, hoping to turn the situation around. In front of the television cameras, she repeatedly emphasized that her actions were by the book and for the benefit of the community. She said, "I didn't want to hurt his family. It was just a misunderstanding. I was only doing what I thought was right to protect our community." However, Karen's justifications only worsened the situation. The more she tried to defend her actions, the more the public saw the lack of sincerity in her words. No one believed the excuse of someone who ordered the arrest of a person attending a funeral just because of HOA rules, without considering the context. The public continued to condemn her. More than 80% of residents in the area expressed their dissatisfaction and demanded disciplinary action against Karen. This further cemented her position as a target of criticism that could not be salvaged. Social media was ablaze with passionate discussions, and 35% of neighborhood residents declared they would leave the community if Karen continued to hold the position of HOA president. Karen tried to counterattack, but the more she did so, the more she tarnished her image in the eyes of the public. People no longer saw her as a community protector, but as a symbol of abuse of power. The story quickly spread, and within a week, Karen's name had become a joke on social media. Hashtag Karen the Tyrant became a viral hashtag, and memes mocking her flooded platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The media even went further, analyzing Karen's previous violations and imposing HOA rules, showing that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of her abuse of power. Former residents of the neighborhood began to share their stories, recounting how Karen had violated their rights, such as imposing unreasonable fines for trivial reasons or demanding they follow irrational rules. Truth came to light. Karen could no longer salvage her career. She became a victim of the very abuse of power she had once used to force others to comply with her will. With the strong public and media backlash, Mark Harris decided that it was time to fully clarify the matter. He could not let Karen escape the consequences of her abuse of power without being held accountable. As U.S. Attorney General, Mark had the authority to demand a thorough investigation into Karen's actions and the HOA under her leadership. Immediately after Mark made his request, a large-scale investigation was launched. Over 50 investigators from multiple federal agencies began reviewing all HOA records, from meeting minutes to decisions and actions Karen had taken during her tenure. The investigators didn't just work on paper. They also interviewed hundreds of residents from the neighborhood, many of whom had been silent before due to fear. One of the most important details the investigation uncovered was the secret documents Karen had tried to hide. These pieces of evidence showed that Karen had not only used her power to control residents, but had also manipulated decisions related to fines and violations in an extremely biased manner. A prime example was Karen imposing unreasonable fines on families from minority ethnic groups, while overlooking or being lenient with other residents simply because they fit her preferred mold. Thousands of pages documenting these violations were collected and became part of the substantial evidence against her. The evidence grew increasingly clear, and over 30 residents joined the investigation, providing credible testimony about the racial discrimination and abuse of power Karen had committed. Many of them revealed that they had endured harassment or fines for trivial reasons, such as improperly parked tires, mismatched mailbox colors, and even the way they decorated their yards. The residents recorded and provided specific examples, highlighting the injustice they had suffered under Karen's leadership. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that Karen had abused her HOA power to push out residents who did not conform to her standards, using the regulations as a tool to punish those who did not comply with her control. Around 120 records of unreasonable fines were investigated and reassessed, with at least 40% of them deemed to lack clear legal grounds. The investigation became a major campaign, and not long after, Karen Bradley was faced with serious charges. She was indicted on charges of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and violation of civil rights. Specifically, Karen was sued for unlawful detention, harassment, and abuse of power. These charges were the result of her illegal arrest of Ethan, as well as violations of residents' rights throughout her tenure. A criminal investigation was expanded, and subsequent interviews revealed even more wrongdoing that Karen had carried out over a long period without detection. The numbers proved the seriousness of the situation. 500 residents from the neighborhood signed a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA, demanding that justice be served. Data from the investigation showed that more than 30% of the residents who participated in the lawsuit were direct victims of Karen's abuses of power. Karen could no longer conceal her wrongdoings. The evidence uncovered in the investigation left her with no power to defend herself. Faced with a barrage of accusations from the residents of the community, whom she had oppressed and abused for so long, Karen had no choice but to step down from her position as HOA president. This decision was not voluntary, but came from an overwhelming pressure from both the law and public opinion. The media, which had been following and reporting on the story from the beginning, did not miss the opportunity to highlight Karen's downfall. Headlines continued to emerge, most of them mocking and expressing humor at her helplessness. From HOA president to power abuse symbol, Karen Bradley can't escape was one of the prominent headlines, immediately capturing the attention of both the online community and the general public. She was dismissed from her position as HOA president, not only for the unlawful arrest of Ethan, but also for a series of serious violations in managing and running the neighborhood. From imposing unreasonable regulations to unfair and discriminatory fines, Karen had created a living environment full of fear and injustice. But now, all she received in return was isolation and criticism from all sides. Faced with civil lawsuits from many residents of the neighborhood, Karen was forced to appear in court to face charges she could not deny. More than 100 residents had signed the lawsuit, demanding justice be served and to reclaim what they had lost under Karen's leadership. These lawsuits not only involved unreasonable fines, but also included charges such as abuse of power, harassment, and racial discrimination. Karen's downfall was a testament to the fact that no one can abuse power without facing consequences. Meanwhile, Ethan and Mark walked out of the courthouse as victors. Those who had been treated unfairly now received respect and admiration from the community. With Karen being forced to face justice, their family not only regained their honor, but also achieved something much greater, pushing back against the abuse of power by organizations like the HOA. The community no longer lived in fear of power abusers like Karen. Ethan and Mark not only gained recognition from society, but also became symbols of resistance against oppression and injustice. Ethan, who had previously been arrested at his brother's funeral, was now not only granted freedom, but was also recognized as a hero. He not only triumphed in the legal battle, but also in the moral and justice battle. The neighborhood residents witnessed a clear transformation. A person who had once been seen as a villain had now become a symbol of courage and resilience in the face of adversity. Mark, in his role as U.S. Attorney General, proved the courage and power of the law in upholding justice. However, he did not forget that this victory belonged to the family and the community, not just to him alone. He was proud to have helped push back against Karen's abuse of power, but above all, he was pleased that justice had been served, and those who had suffered injustice for so long could now see the light at the end of the tunnel. The community was now freed from Karen's oppressive control, and this meant more than any legal victory. As Karen fell into complete collapse, the residents who had once been ruled by her now felt freer than ever before. They realized that by standing up and fighting for justice, they could change everything, no matter how powerful the person in charge. The downfall of Karen and the victory of Ethan and Mark marked an important milestone in restoring order and justice within the community. It underscored the message that no one, no matter how powerful or high-ranking, can escape the consequences of wrongful actions. Justice always prevails, and in the end, it was the resilience of people like Ethan and Mark that brought light to the community. Thus, the story of Karen Bradley and her downfall came to a close, but the questions about power and justice still resonate within each of us. From being at the pinnacle of power, Karen witnessed her complete ruin, not only because of her abuse of power but also because of the resilience and unyielding fight of Ethan and Mark Harris. They not only won in the legal battle, but they also restored faith in justice and fairness within the community. We did not only witness the downfall of one individual but the awakening of a community, where people stood up against injustice and the abuse of power. This story serves as a reminder that, no matter how powerful, justice always finds a way to triumph. If you found this story interesting and want to continue following dramatic cases and lessons about power, justice, and the law, don't forget to subscribe to the HOA Karen Files channel today. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an exciting story and the latest updates. We look forward to receiving your support and feedback. Leave a comment below the video with your thoughts and feel free to share this story with your friends and family. Join us as we explore more surprising stories about power, law, and cases that not everyone dares to face. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Karen and the HOA tried to steal my land. Here's what happened next. You've probably heard of the struggles between residents and powerful organizations, but the story we're about to share with you today is not just any ordinary battle. This is a tough and surprising legal battle between a man and the Homeowners Association, HOA, when he discovered that the HOA might have been quietly infringing on his family's property rights in a land development project without any prior notice. David Cooper, an ordinary resident, had spent his whole life defending his family's land. This land was not just a material asset, but a precious inheritance passed down through 3 generations. But when the HOA sent a notice about the rezoning of property boundaries, everything he had once trusted seemed to fall apart. However, David didn't give up. He began the fight not only for his personal interests, but also for the benefit of the entire community. With the help of allies like Martha Williams, an elderly neighbor, and Robert Lee, a surveying expert, David relentlessly fought, gathered evidence, and battled to protect not only his own ownership rights, but also justice for everyone living in this neighborhood. From unexpected discoveries of archaeological signs to uncovering a shady connection between Karen Smith, the HOA president, and real estate developers, this battle became more intense. However, will David be able to win this fight and ensure that the community's rights are protected? Stay tuned until the end of the story to find out the unexpected result that you won't believe. So what do you think about this story? Do you believe the HOA is truly acting for the community's benefit, or is it simply for the personal gain of those in charge? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below the video. We look forward to hearing your feedback and perspectives on this intense battle. Don't forget to watch the entire story, as there are surprising twists you won't want to miss. Let's discover how David won and whether justice was truly served in this case. My name is David Cooper, and I've lived on my family's land for 3 generations. This land has witnessed countless springs and family stories, from my grandfather to my father, and now to me. Every stone, Every ancient tree in the garden holds a memory. I'm sure you understand this feeling, when a place is not just a home but a remnant of history, right? I thought I was lucky to have a family with such a piece of land. But then, one day, an unexpected letter arrived. It wasn't a congratulatory letter, nor was it any cheerful announcement. That letter felt like a slap to my face. After reviewing the community boundaries, it read, "The land behind your house has been reclassified as common land for the development of a resort." I couldn't believe it. I looked at the letter, then looked back at the land before me. How could this be? 3 generations of my family have lived and cared for this land. Over 3 lifetimes, we've planted trees, built, and created memories here. And now, all of it, just because of one signature, one heartless decision from the Homeowners Association, HOA. They want to seize a portion of my land to build a luxury resort. I had no say in this. They didn't notify us, didn't ask for permission. Just one letter said it all. On March 17th, 2023, I stood in front of my house, reading the letter for the 3rd time. I still couldn't believe it. What were they planning to do? Take away 1.2 acres of land that my ancestors have worked hard to build and protect for nearly 80 years? My land, which is not just land, but part of our history. I couldn't let them do this. When I thought about what was at stake, I felt angry, not because of the value of the land, but because of the absurdity of their actions. The entire community, just for a resort, and they trample on the rights of a family that has been tied to this land for so many years. And me? I couldn't just stand by and watch them take what belonged to me. The feeling at that moment was indescribable. It was as if someone had just ripped away a part of my body. Can you imagine that? 3 generations, my ancestors poured so much effort into this place, and now, just because of one letter, they intended to erase everything. This loss wasn't just about land. It was about a piece of my soul and my family's soul. After receiving the HOA's letter, I couldn't sit still. This wasn't a small decision. It was something that would completely change the lives of my family and me. How could I let them invade the land that has been part of our family for 3 generations? Determined to find out why and confront Karen Smith, the president of the HOA, I stepped outside and went straight to her house. Karen lives in a luxurious villa, right near the community area. Her house is worth over $1.5 million, more than the combined value of my 3 houses. It was no surprise when I saw her open the door with a perfect smile, the smile of someone who has everything and never has to worry about anything. "Hello, David. Is there something I can help you with?" Karen said, her voice sweet, but with something insincere about it. She was wearing an expensive tracksuit, as if she had just come back from working out, though I had never seen her move a muscle in the time I'd lived here. "Karen, I need to know why the HOA decided to take a portion of my land," I replied, trying to stay calm even though anger was rising inside me. "This land isn't just land. It's my family's heritage. It's been ours for 3 generations. How can you make such decisions without discussing them with me?" Karen shrugged and flashed a charming smile. "Oh, David, I understand your frustration, but you don't need to worry. This plan is actually for the benefit of the whole community. We're developing a high-end resort on that land. You'll see, this resort will bring many benefits: a large swimming pool, a fancy cocktail bar, and a relaxation space for all the residents in the neighborhood." She glanced at her watch as if urging me to hurry up and listen to her. "So, I'm supposed to benefit from you taking my land to build a resort?" I asked again, looking her in the eye. It felt like a joke. Really, I couldn't understand how someone could say these things without feeling ashamed. Karen laughed, unfazed. "Yes, exactly. A modern resort will increase the land value around here significantly. And of course, you'll benefit from it too. Especially the pool area. It'll be very convenient for you, right? You'll have a great relaxing space right in your neighborhood." The luxurious pool Karen mentioned? We had done the math, and according to the HOA's maps, the area designated for the resort is 3.5 acres, of which more than 1 acre belongs to me. I'm sure I never received any notification about this plan. At that moment, I felt like I was listening to a speech from a marketing expert with no truth to it at all. Karen's words seemed like they were carefully prepared to soothe the residents. Easy to hear, but not convincing at all. I looked at her face and immediately noticed the lack of sincerity. "So, according to you, I'm supposed to just sit quietly and watch the HOA take my land while enjoying a few minor conveniences? I replied. Karen tried to ease the tension. David, don't misunderstand me. You'll still have the right to use this space as usual. Just think of it as an added benefit for you. The residents will all benefit from these new amenities. Things won't change much, just a few improvements. She also didn't forget to mention the development fees the HOA planned to charge residents to maintain the resort amenities. According to the HOA documents, every family in the neighborhood would have to pay an additional $800 per year to maintain the new amenities, excluding other service fees. All of this was packaged in a promise to improve the community. Just then, I spotted a new piece of paper on Karen's desk, a map with boundary lines I had never seen before. The straight lines cut through my beloved garden, through the very trees I had planted with my father. That's exactly what I needed. Evidence showing that the HOA had decided to infringe on my land without notifying me. After the tense meeting with Karen Smith, I couldn't sit still any longer. It was clear that everything was part of a deliberate arrangement, and I began to realize that I wasn't just fighting for land. I was fighting against a much larger conspiracy. But I needed specific evidence to confront the HOA and those behind them. And that's when I started paying attention to the construction at Jake and Laura Davis's house, the neighbors right next to me. On March 24th, as I was having breakfast, I looked out the window and saw a crew laying the foundation for a swimming pool right next to my land. This pool, approximately 80 feet long and 60 feet wide, was clearly being built so close to my property line that it could almost touch it. What was strange was that I hadn't received any official notification from the HOA about any changes to the property boundaries. There had been no meetings, no notices sent to me. Yet here was this large-scale project as if they already knew exactly how things would change. Immediately, I realized this wasn't a coincidence. The pool was being built in a rush, almost as if it had been started before the property lines were officially changed according to the HOA's plan. The distance from the pool to my land was only about 3 meters, and from the way it was being placed, I knew for sure that if my land was reclassified, they would have a pool right up against their property line. This wasn't just a random construction. This was a carefully planned move, as if they knew they would gain ownership of this land once the HOA changed the boundaries. According to the map the HOA had sent me, the resort development would occupy about 1.2 acres of my land, a significant amount. Meanwhile, Jake and Laura's pool took up about 0.1 acres, but was positioned right against my property line, just 3 meters away, leading me to suspect that all of this had been planned long before. This made me realize that not only was the HOA exploiting the system to seize my land, but there was a clear collaboration between the HOA and real estate developers. Jake and Laura weren't victims in this story. They were participants in a larger plan, part of manipulating community property, starting with the construction of this pool. So, after noticing this irregularity, I began reaching out to other neighbors to see if they had noticed anything unusual. Questions started forming in my mind. Were all of these actions part of a larger conspiracy to develop a resort and completely transform my neighborhood into a high-end tourist spot without anyone's consent? Seeing Jake and Laura building a pool right next to my land, I couldn't help but think of those Hollywood movies where the villains always start big projects right in front of everyone, while everyone stays silent. But this wasn't a movie, this was my life, and I wasn't about to sit back and watch them take the next step. It seemed like they had planned this all along, and I was just the one who showed up too late to realize it. Things became even more complicated when I realized I was up against a system that seemed to have been meticulously planned long ago. The covert actions of the HOA, combined with their collaboration with real estate developers, made me unable to shake off my suspicions about their true intentions. I had mentally prepared myself for this battle, but I knew I needed clear evidence to face them head-on. So, I turned back to the family documents, the maps my grandfather had carefully drawn many years ago. These maps, though yellowed with age, still held valuable information that I believed could change the game. I began rummaging through the old trunk my grandfather had left me, searching for anything that could prove that my land still belonged to the family. One evening, as the dim light illuminated the maps, I found a very important detail. On one of my grandfather's maps, there was a small note in the corner mentioning survey markers from 1952. This was a detail I had never noticed before, and it turned out to be the key to everything. The HOA's map only drew rigid straight lines, ignoring natural features like the stream, ancient trees, or rock outcrops that my grandfather had marked. But my grandfather's map was different. It followed the natural geographic landmarks, which, as I understood, still existed to this day. I compared my grandfather's maps with the new map the HOA had sent me, and I noticed a stark difference. An area of about 1 acre of my land, which the HOA claimed was common land, was completely missing from their map. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a serious error, possibly part of a plot to unlawfully seize my land. When I discovered this, I felt a sense of relief. At least I now had something in hand to prove that the HOA was trying to manipulate my land. But I knew that just having this wasn't enough. I needed the help of a real survey expert, someone who could verify the survey markers my grandfather had recorded back in 1952. After a few calls, I found Robert Lee, a survey expert my father had worked with before. Robert was meticulous and careful, and I knew he wouldn't miss any details. He had helped me with land-related work in the past, and now I needed his help once again. When I told Robert about my findings and the HOA's plans, he didn't hesitate to agree to help me. "David, I've worked on this land for a long time. If something's wrong, I'll find it right away. Don't worry, we'll go over all the survey markers and verify what your grandfather left behind." With Robert's help, we began looking for the survey markers my grandfather had noted. Robert's specialized surveying tools and our combined patience helped us discover something crucial. The 1952 survey markers were still intact, and they didn't just confirm the land boundaries. They indicated that the land the HOA was disputing actually belonged to me. This was irrefutable evidence. Can you imagine? A 1952 map turned out to be the thing that saved me from the HOA's manipulation. The people at the HOA might have modern machinery and advanced software, but perhaps they forgot one thing. Sometimes, all it takes is an old map drawn by my grandfather to expose their plot. Maybe I've grown older, but at least I can still beat them with the very family documents they underestimated. After discovering the 1952 survey markers and noticing the discrepancies in the HOA's map, I knew I had to do more than just gather evidence. On my own, with old documents and a few photos, I wasn't strong enough to confront Karen Smith and those behind her. I needed an ally. And the first person I thought of was Martha Williams, the elderly neighbor who lived at the end of the street. Martha had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, and she was one of the first people I met when my family moved here. Her house sat at the end of the road, surrounded by a beautiful garden that she tended to like a gardening expert. Every time I stopped by, she would be sitting on the porch in her old wooden chair, sipping tea and reading a book. She was an intellectual, always sharing interesting stories about the neighborhood's history, especially about the HOA, which she had little affection for. I walked up to her porch, knocked on the door, and stood there for a moment. Martha opened the door, smiling as she always did. She was a very approachable person, but her sharp gaze couldn't be hidden. "David, hello, what's going on?" she asked in a soft voice, but there was a hint of suspicion. "I need to talk to you about something, Martha." "It's about the HOA and my family's land," I said, not hiding the worry in my voice. "I need your help." She invited me in, and we sat down at the dining table in her living room, surrounded by old paintings and books stacked on the shelves. "Tell me, what's got you so worried?" she asked as she poured me some tea. "How could I not be worried when my family's land is being threatened?" I began telling her about the HOA's plan to reclassify my land and the strange things I noticed in their map. "I suspect something isn't right, and I think you'll understand." Martha listened in silence, her eyes seeming to sharpen. "David, if you think this is the first time the HOA has done something like this, you're wrong. I've lived here long enough to know that they're not some benevolent organization. They've forced people to sell their land and leave." I felt a spark in my mind. "What? You're saying Karen and the HOA did this to other people in the neighborhood?" Martha nodded, placing her teacup on the table. "Yes, indeed. Remember the Henderson's house? They lived right next to me and were forced to sell their land to the HOA, even though their land was worth much more than what the HOA offered. The reason they gave was that the HOA needed the land for a community development project. But the truth is, that land was turned into a resort development with real estate developers behind it." I was shocked. "So you didn't find anything odd about that?" Martha sighed softly, her smile fading. Odd. Of course it was odd. I asked the Hendersons why they sold, but they just stayed quiet, afraid to say much. I'm sure Karen was involved in this. And don't forget, she has very close ties with the real estate developers. She's not doing this for the community, David. She's doing it for personal gain. Her words were like a cold splash of water to my face. This wasn't the first time the HOA had done this, and I was getting caught up in a conspiracy I didn't fully understand yet. But I knew I couldn't give up. If this had happened before, it could very well happen to me. I want to know more. I continued, my voice resolute. Can you tell me more about the previous cases? And are there any details you think could help me? Martha looked at me for a moment, then sighed as if she were tired of what she knew. David, I've known about this for a long time. The HOA members have special relationships with the developers, and they're always looking for ways to change land boundaries without informing anyone. They've even changed documents and maps in internal meetings without notifying the residents. Everything's handled in secret, like they're doing something good for the community, but in reality, they're just trying to grab more property. I listened to her every word, clearly sensing the frustration in Martha's voice. What she shared only made me more certain that Karen and the HOA were intentionally hiding these changes to serve their own interests. This was a big game, and I was the last to realize I was being played. So what do I do now? I asked, feeling confused. Martha looked at me deeply. You need to expose everything. I can't do anything more because I'm too old, but you can. You need to find solid evidence to expose everything, not just what they're doing to you, but also to everyone else in this community. After the conversation with Martha, I felt like I had just heard a long, tragic story. But looking back, I couldn't help but smirk. When the people in the HOA thought they could deceive the residents who have lived here their whole lives, they forgot that people like Martha could see things more clearly than anyone else. In reality, I wasn't the only one being deceived, and these people didn't know that we were starting to figure out their game. I now had the support of people in the community and allies like Martha and Robert Lee. We all knew that if we wanted to win this fight, we needed to be thorough and gather enough evidence to expose the HOA's schemes. The next day, I met with Robert at his office. He was the only person I trusted to help me verify the old survey markers my grandfather had left behind. Robert was a surveyor, and he had helped my family with numerous projects in the past. When I told him about the 1952 survey markers I had discovered, he was eager to get involved. David, I know the area you're talking about. I surveyed this land back in the 90s, and I remember there were plenty of old survey markers around here. But the important thing is, we need to find the remaining markers and verify that they match what your grandfather recorded, Robert said in a calm, yet confident tone. For an entire week, we scoured every inch of land, looking for the old survey markers that my grandfather had marked. With the help of modern surveying tools, we finally found one of the remaining markers, a small stone marker next to an ancient tree that my grandfather had drawn on the map. This confirmed that the area of my land was actually larger than what the HOA had marked. But there was something even more important. We discovered a significant area within my land where my grandfather had left notes about historical artifacts. David, I think we're finding something bigger, Robert said after checking some archaeological records. If what I found is correct, this area might have been the site of an ancient civilization. I'll need an archaeologist to verify this. But if it's true, this is an important archaeological site and could be protected under historical preservation laws. That was a turning point. If we could verify that my land contained historical artifacts, we would have a powerful weapon to fight the HOA. Karen and the HOA's resort project would have to be stopped immediately if we could prove this was an area that needed preservation under the law. I knew this was my only chance to protect my land. I decided to contact an archaeologist, someone I knew through an old friend. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a local archaeology expert, agreed to come and inspect my land. After conducting a thorough survey, she confirmed that the site I had discovered was likely to contain ancient artifacts, including stone tools and pottery fragments. She said, "If these findings are verified, your land will fall under preservation laws, and no construction projects can take place in this area." We had gathered enough evidence and submitted a request for historic preservation review to the relevant authorities. This not only protected my land, but also dealt a significant blow to the HOA's plan. But I knew the HOA wouldn't easily give up on their goal. And as I predicted, when Karen and the HOA members realized that I was preparing to take action, they began working even more covertly. A week after I submitted the preservation request, I received a secret call from a friend in the community. "David, you need to be careful. I just heard from a friend of mine in the HOA. They're trying to change the maps again and will keep attempting to take your land without notifying anyone." The voice of my friend sounded worried, and I knew the situation was getting even more serious. With this information, I decided not to sit back. My team and I began collecting more evidence of the HOA's secret meetings and looked into whether they were carrying out any shady actions. I started contacting residents in the neighborhood to ask if they had heard anything about the changes to the land boundaries, and I also looked into Karen's relationships with real estate developers. Soon after, I discovered something crucial. One of the HOA members, Frank Thompson, had close ties with the real estate company Karen was collaborating with. This company planned to develop a resort right on my land, and Frank Thompson was the one pushing this plan in the HOA's internal meetings. I have to admit, what I uncovered during these days was not only frightening, but also a bit ridiculous. Did they really think they could hide everything without anyone noticing? The people in this HOA clearly didn't understand that, no matter how much they lied, eventually, the truth would come out. After a week of intense preparation, I finally received a notification from the HOA about an emergency meeting they were holding. This meeting would decide on the land boundary changes in the community, and it could potentially affect my land directly. I knew this was a pivotal moment. If I didn't act now, everything I had worked for would be in vain. The meeting was scheduled for April 15th, 2025, and from what I had heard from a few friends in the neighborhood, Karen Smith had planned to push through the land boundary changes quickly and without opposition. She was confident that everything was arranged and that it would only take a few votes to win. But I knew this time, she wouldn't win so easily. I had prepared meticulously. Robert Lee and I had thoroughly reviewed all the survey documents, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. The archaeological evidence had been confirmed and sent out, and I had also prepared legal documents to prove that my land was legally owned and could not be altered or seized. I had also reached out to other residents in the neighborhood who might support me in this struggle. Everything had been carefully arranged. On the day of the meeting, I walked into the HOA meeting room, where over 50 residents had gathered, including HOA board members, with Karen and her allies present. The atmosphere was tense as soon as I stepped into the room. All eyes were on me, and I could feel the discontent from those who realized that this meeting wouldn't be like the others. Karen stood up, a smug look on her face. She scanned the room and began introducing the plan to change the land boundaries. "We've been discussing improving the infrastructure in this area for a while," Karen began. "The land reclassification will help develop the community and bring benefits to all of us. We've gathered all the necessary information, and now it's time for us to make a decision." I didn't let her speak any longer. I stood up, holding a thick stack of documents, and began to speak. "Sorry, Karen, but I can't let you continue without addressing the truth," I said, my voice firm. "What you're saying is false, and I have evidence to prove it." The room fell silent, everyone listening intently. I presented the HOA's map and compared it to the survey map I had found, pointing out the discrepancies in the boundaries the HOA had drawn. "As you can see," I continued, "this is the HOA's map. And here's my grandfather's map. It's much clearer and more accurate. The boundaries that the HOA has proposed are not only wrong, but also unlawfully take a significant portion of my legal land." I clarified every point, showing that the land division proposed by the HOA was completely unreasonable. "And not only that, do you see this?" I continued, holding up the archaeological evidence I had gathered, proving that my land contained historical artifacts. "These are pottery fragments and stone tools that we found on my land. According to the law, this land cannot be developed if it contains historical artifacts. This means that the HOA's construction plans cannot proceed without approval from historical preservation authorities." Karen tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her stop me. I continued presenting the evidence I had prepared. "And here's something very important you should know. I've also discovered that Karen Smith and some members of the HOA have ties to real estate developers who would directly benefit from seizing my land to build a resort. This is a clear conflict of interest, and I filed a complaint with the relevant authorities about this." The room erupted in noise, with neighbors whispering and exchanging opinions. The people I had talked to and convinced earlier began standing up and criticizing the HOA's actions. The voices of opposition grew louder. Karen lost her composure. She stood up, hurriedly saying, "These are just accusations. We've done everything for the benefit of the community. There's no way we would do this for personal gain." But I had prepared a decisive piece of evidence. "If you want to know the truth, look at these emails," I said, and immediately presented the emails I had collected, showing that members of the HOA had discussed plans to collaborate with real estate developers to transfer land without informing the community. The atmosphere in the room became tense. HOA members started looking nervous, and the residents who had stood by me began supporting me even more strongly. Finally, I turned to Karen and said, "With all this evidence, I believe you all will agree that changing these land boundaries is unacceptable." After a tense vote, the final result was clear. The HOA had failed. The board members and most of the residents voted against the land boundary change. Karen and her allies lost, and their resort development plan was canceled. Immediately after the meeting, I received a call from one of the HOA board members. Their voice sounded anxious, and I knew something important was happening. "David," they said, "Karen and the board have met after the vote. They've decided to concede and will withdraw the request to seize your land." At that moment, I felt a new breath of relief in my chest. Not because I had won the battle, but because I knew that all my efforts, along with the support of the residents in the neighborhood, had helped protect both my rights and the community's. But what was even more notable were the conditions I had set to ensure that the HOA wouldn't repeat these actions in the future. First, I demanded a public apology from Karen and the HOA members for the way they had treated my family and the residents. This wasn't just a typical apology. I wanted them to take responsibility for their actions and admit that they were wrong for not informing the community about such important changes. Second, I demanded improvements in the neighborhood's noise regulations. The loud parties from residents like Jake and Laura had kept me awake many nights. Of course, the neighborhood needed recreational spaces, but the noise couldn't infringe on the rights of others. This was especially important for older residents like Martha, who needed a quiet space to live. Finally, I required the HOA to create a fund to assist with boundary verification for every family in the community. This was crucial to avoid unnecessary land disputes in the future. This way, residents could be confident that their rights wouldn't be violated without their knowledge. After my proposal was accepted, I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had achieved. Not only had I protected my land, but I had also helped safeguard the rights of the entire community. But the story didn't end there. With this change, I was invited to attend a meeting with the entire HOA and the residents of the neighborhood. And then, something unexpected happened. I was appointed to the Architectural Council. I never thought I would receive such great trust. In fact, I was quite stunned when I was informed of this decision. However, I quickly realized that this was an opportunity for me to continue defending the community's interests, not just for my family, but for my neighbors as well. Being part of the Architectural Council meant that I could participate in deciding development projects in the neighborhood, ensuring that all decisions were transparent and fair. Being selected for the Architectural Council felt like I had become a guardian of my community. The decisions I made would not only affect my family's land, but also impact all the residents in this neighborhood. This was a huge responsibility, but I was ready to embrace it. Joining the council wasn't just an opportunity to correct past mistakes, but also to ensure that all residents in the neighborhood were treated fairly and had a voice in shaping the future of the community. In the end, after relentless effort, David achieved a great victory. Not only had he protected his family's land, but he had also forced the HOA to change the way they treated the residents of the community. With solid historical and legal evidence, David not only revealed the truth, but also set reasonable demands to protect the rights of everyone. The public apology, improved noise regulations, and the creation of a fund to assist with boundary verification for the community were the conditions David set to ensure that past mistakes would not be repeated. And the result couldn't have been clearer. David not only reclaimed his land ownership, but was also invited to join the Architectural Council, becoming a protector of his community's interests. But the story doesn't end here. It opens up an important lesson about property rights, fairness, and the responsibilities of powerful organizations. Can we trust organizations like the HOA? And do we truly know what's happening in our own communities? The question is, if you were in David's shoes, what would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share your opinions on this story. If you found this story interesting and want to follow more captivating content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next stories. HOA Karen blocked my driveway, so I dug a trench and built a medieval bridge. Hello everyone. Today we are going to explore a thrilling, intense, and dramatic story. It's the Battle of Tom, an ordinary resident in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, as he is forced to confront the abuse of power by Karen, the HOA, Homeowners Association, president, a person who has used her power to control everything in the neighborhood, from strict rules about house decorations to imposing unreasonable laws on the residents' lives. From Karen's SUV getting stuck in a trench that Tom built to her continuous attempts to pressure him and the community, the story quickly escalates into a tense legal battle. But the story doesn't just stop at resisting unreasonable rules. Tom not only wants to protect his property, but he also stands up to expose Karen's corruption and abuse of power within the HOA. An official investigation was launched, and the authorities started to take action. Then, a major event occurred when the story hit the media and spread on social media, drawing the community's attention. Can Tom win this battle? And will Karen have to pay for her wrongdoings? Watch the full story so you don't miss any details of this struggle between power and justice. Don't forget to leave your opinions and personal thoughts in the comments below this video. Do you think Tom did the right thing standing up against Karen? Or do you have a different perspective? We look forward to hearing your feedback. Stay tuned for more exciting developments in this gripping story. I'm Tom, an ordinary man living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Every morning, I wake up at 7 a.m., enjoy a black coffee, and soak in the peaceful atmosphere of the neighborhood. My job is nothing special, just the usual office work, nothing too stressful, and relaxing evenings with family. My life is quite simple, and I have no complaints until I met Karen. Karen is the woman who lives 2 houses down, and if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, Homeowners Association, you'll immediately understand the feeling when someone like Karen has power in her hands. Karen is not just a regular HOA member, she's the president. And in the literal sense of the word president, Karen doesn't just care about making the neighborhood look nice and orderly. She wants to control everything, from your driving habits to the exact shade of paint you put on your front gate. Imagine this. One beautiful morning, I'm walking out to grab my newspaper when I find Karen standing in front of my house, holding a checklist. You guessed it, HOA standard inspection. If you have grass that isn't trimmed to the HOA required length, or if your gate is too bright silver compared to the standards, you'll get a warning letter. Everything has to be perfect, no room for creativity or individuality. I used to think it was a small issue, until my life started to be affected. Karen is not just the one inspecting the rules. She's the one enforcing them strictly, and, especially, there's never a clear reason for her decisions. The first time I encountered her intervention was when I first moved into this neighborhood. I thought this would be a place where I could live in peace, but clearly, Karen had decided that I wasn't allowed to live normally. One Tuesday morning, I woke up at 7 a.m. as usual, ready to face the new day. The view outside the window was as peaceful as ever. The whole neighborhood was quiet. No noise. Only the sound of birds chirping from the tall trees. I stepped outside, holding my coffee cup, getting ready to walk out and grab the paper, just like I always do. But that day, everything was different. As I stepped out the door, my eyes were immediately drawn to a luxury SUV blocking my entire driveway. Karen's car, I recognized it right away. I looked around, but didn't see anyone. Yet the car was still there, parked right in front of my gate, as if it had become part of the scenery. What was strange was that I hadn't received any notice from the HOA, no warning, no request that her car would be parked there. Yet the car was parked as though it were perfectly normal. Anticipating that this situation would escalate, I walked closer to the SUV with an uncomfortable feeling. Trying to stay calm, I gently tapped on Karen's car window. When she lowered the window, I could feel the smugness in her gaze. "Good morning, Karen," I began, trying to keep my voice polite. "Your car is blocking my entire driveway. Could you move it for me?" Karen looked at me with an unchanging expression. Not hurried at all. She just smirked and replied sweetly, yet sarcastically. "Oh, I know, Tom. But this car is staying here for a bit because the HOA needs to inspect your driveway to ensure everything complies with the standards." I stood there stunned. Inspect my driveway. I had lived here for over 2 years, and no one from the HOA had ever inspected my driveway. There had been no notice, no calls, no emails from the HOA board. Yet now, Karen casually declared that she and the HOA had the right to make such decisions. "I don't understand," I said, my voice slightly wavering with confusion. "Why haven't I received any notice about this? You can't just park your car here without informing me. This doesn't make sense." Karen looked at me, then sighed gently, as if explaining something too simple to grasp. "It's not a big deal, Tom. This is an HOA requirement. We just want to check your driveway to make sure it doesn't violate any aesthetic or structural regulations. If you don't cooperate, the HOA will have to fine you because this is a clear violation." I could feel the anger rising within me. Although I tried to stay calm, I couldn't ignore the injustice in Karen's words. Not only had she failed to notify me, but she was also openly imposing HOA power on my personal property without a reasonable cause. "Karen, you can't just park your car here without any prior notice. This is my property, and I have the right to ask you to move it immediately," I replied, now losing my patience. Not only did Karen refuse to move her car, but she also shrugged as though she were the one who had the final say. "If you don't cooperate, the HOA will fine you, Tom," she said coldly. "Not complying with the rules is a violation, and we will start by fining you $100 for each day you don't comply with the board's request. This time, we won't show any leniency." I stood frozen, shocked by the $100 fine she had just mentioned. A small amount on the surface, but it had a huge impact on those living in this neighborhood. Just by not complying with one of the rules, no matter how unreasonable, you could be fined $100 every day. And if this continued, the amount could quickly rise into the thousands. After Karen's SUV continued to block my driveway, I decided I couldn't tolerate this anymore. If I let this continue, I would always be under Karen and the HOA's control, and I couldn't let that happen. I needed to understand the HOA's regulations and the laws surrounding personal property. So, I began my thorough research. The whole day, I dedicated myself to going through legal documents about urban planning and HOA regulations. I opened materials from various sources, city planning books, official websites, and HOA regulations I had collected from neighbors. Everything had to be reviewed carefully to find any loopholes I could use in this legal battle. After hours of searching, I found a very important section in the city's regulations. A section titled Renovations and Temporary Structures on Private Property really surprised me. It contained a clause that said, property owners have the right to build security measures, including temporary fences, gates, and protective structures, as long as these structures are not permanent and have a permit from the city. Reading this, I felt like I had just discovered a treasure. Building a protective structure wasn't prohibited as long as it wasn't permanent and had legal approval from the city. This was the key to protecting my property without breaking the law. I flipped through more pages and found another section titled Regulations on Temporary Structures and Building Permits. This section clearly stated, property owners must apply for a permit to build any structure on their land, even temporary ones. To obtain the permit, the structure must meet safety and environmental requirements and not impact public space. This further confirmed that I could build a protective structure without legal issues. I just needed to apply for a permit from the city, which wasn't a big problem. To make sure I fully understood, I continued researching and found additional information on how protective structures could affect surrounding areas. After a few more hours of searching, I discovered a crucial clause in the HOA regulations, stating, HOA has no authority to interfere with personal property protection measures as long as they do not invade common areas of the community or alter the structure of other properties. This meant that if I built a fence or a protective structure, as long as it didn't affect other properties or public space, the HOA had no authority to interfere. However, to be certain about every aspect, I decided to reach out to a friend of mine, Mark, a lawyer experienced in zoning and construction law matters. I called him and explained the entire situation. Mark listened carefully, and after I presented the documents I had found, he confirmed that I was absolutely correct. Tom, what you found in the documents is reasonable. The regulations about building temporary fences and protective structures on private property are entirely legal, as long as you apply for a permit and comply with safety and environmental requirements, Mark said. I recommend you fill out the permit application and prepare the necessary documents to submit to the city. Also, don't forget to clearly state the security purpose in the application. With Mark's confirmation, I felt like a big door had opened before me. Not only did I have the right to build protective measures, but now I also knew exactly what steps to take to legalize them. I decided to start immediately, knowing this was my opportunity not only to protect my property, but also to counter Karen's and HOA's overreach. Now, I no longer had to worry about whether I was violating the law. I had all the information I needed, and the next step was to apply for a permit from the city. I wasn't just going to build a fence. I was going to create a temporary structure that HOA couldn't stop. I started envisioning the drawbridge I would build, a symbol not only of my protection of my property, but also of how I would confront HOA's oppression. Once I received confirmation from lawyer Mark that my plan was entirely legal, there was no reason to hesitate. My determination was clear, and I immediately set things into motion. I wasn't just planning to build a small or simple structure. I was planning to create a solid barrier, strong enough to prevent any vehicle, especially Karen's SUV, from approaching my driveway again. The next day, I contacted a machinery rental company and decided to hire an excavator. I wanted to create a real trench, not just a small hole, but a temporary structure large and solid enough to prevent any vehicles from accessing my driveway. A trench not meant to be looked at and abandoned, but a clear strategy to protect my property and assert ownership. I sought out a construction crew with experience, and after discussing the plan with them, they immediately got to work. Everything was planned out clearly. I instructed them to dig a trench 4 feet wide and at least 4 feet deep, a size sufficient to block any vehicle from passing through. The workers began their task early in the morning, and I personally supervised the work, ensuring everything went according to plan. During the digging process, I could hear the machines roaring, dust flying all around. The excavator began tearing into the earth, each scoop lifting layers of dirt, rocks, and grass, gradually exposing the trench that was slowly forming. The trench grew wider, wide enough that no vehicle, including Karen's SUV, could cross it without difficulty. The work didn't just take place during the day, but also continued into the night. Every few hours, the workers would add tools to continue digging, ensuring no interruption. The trench slowly stretched around my driveway, forming a complete loop of protection. After 3 continuous days of work, the trench was finished. When I looked at the result, I felt proud. The trench was about 30 feet long, forming a circular barrier around my driveway. It was 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide enough that no vehicle could pass through easily. A trench dug deep and wide, not only serving a physical purpose, but also sending a clear message. This is my protected area, and no one has the right to invade it without facing consequences. The dirt and rocks were filled around the trench, and inside, the base was hardened to prevent sinking or erosion. The construction workers had finished everything carefully, ensuring that the trench would hold up over time without damage from weather or external factors. Although this was a temporary structure, it looked sturdy and not at all like a makeshift solution. What I especially focused on was that building the trench wasn't just a protective measure. It also created a real barrier that Karen couldn't easily ignore. Once again, I felt proud of what I had accomplished. The people in the neighborhood, upon seeing the trench, couldn't help but be impressed by the seriousness of my efforts. While some didn't understand, many others started to look at me with admiration. After completing the trench, I felt like I had entered into a new battle. The trench, although a solid structure, wasn't enough to fully protect my property, especially when facing someone like Karen and the HOA. That's why I decided to go further, not just stop at digging the earth. As I began to think about the next steps, a bold idea flashed in my mind. Why not build a drawbridge? But not just any ordinary drawbridge, a medieval-style drawbridge. This idea would not only be symbolic, but it would also provide practical functionality. I planned carefully to ensure that this structure wouldn't violate any city or HOA regulations. The drawbridge would be designed simply but solidly, with a chain system that could be raised and lowered to protect my driveway from Karen's interference. The reason I chose a medieval-style bridge was because of its flexibility and the simple mechanical mechanism it offered. A drawbridge could easily be opened and closed, allowing me to control access to my property without creating legal issues. I began detailed planning, selecting materials, calculating the length and width of the bridge. I didn't want the bridge to be too heavy or complicated, so I chose to use strong wood and steel chains, which would not only ensure durability, but also make it look robust enough to prevent any vehicle from crossing. The drawbridge was designed to be about 10 feet long, just enough to cover the space between the sides of the trench and my driveway. The width of the bridge was 3 feet, enough that a small car wouldn't be able to cross if the bridge was raised. The bridge would rest on sturdy columns made of hardwood and load-bearing steel, ensuring that it could bear weight without being damaged. The columns would be deeply buried in the ground, firm like the pillars of ancient bridges. They would be coated with rust-resistant paint to prevent damage from weather and rain. The main material for the bridge was hardwood, carefully selected to be highly durable, able to withstand weather elements, and not crack over time. What made this bridge unique compared to ordinary drawbridges was its mechanism for raising and lowering it. Designed in an ancient style, the bridge featured a large steel chain system and a manual winch mechanism, similar to the drawbridges used in medieval castles. This system worked on a simple but highly effective principle. When needed, I could pull the chains up to raise the bridge, preventing any vehicle from crossing. And when not needed, I could lower the bridge to allow normal access. The steel chains used were extremely durable, capable of bearing heavy weight without snapping or degrading over time. The winch mechanism was designed simply, with a spool of chain wound around a rotating shaft, easily pulled up or lowered with just a few tugs. This allowed me to close the bridge when I needed to protect my property and reopen it when I wanted to allow traffic. Although the bridge was functional, I still wanted it to have an impressive, antique look to make a strong statement. The wooden planks were intricately carved with simple decorative patterns, heavily influenced by medieval architecture. The edges of the bridge were highlighted with dark brown paint, creating a sense of antiquity but still modern, making the bridge look like an essential part of my property. Additionally, the steel chains were also carefully crafted, not just for strength, but also for aesthetics. Each chain link was attached to sturdy metal rings at both ends of the bridge, giving it a look that was both solid and impressive. This bridge wasn't just a protective tool, it was a statement, a symbol of determination and personal power. Once all the parts of the drawbridge were assembled, I began the installation process. The installation wasn't easy, as I had to ensure every part was properly assembled to make sure the bridge worked smoothly without any issues. The chains had to be adjusted correctly so that when raised, the bridge wouldn't shift or fall out of position. The construction workers also had to check the wooden planks to ensure there were no cracks, as this could affect the bridge's stability. I spent a day testing the mechanism for raising and lowering the bridge, making sure everything worked perfectly. Each time I raised the bridge, I checked the tension of the chains, the durability of the joints, and the stability of the pillars. The feeling of the bridge slowly being raised, blocking the entrance to my driveway, truly made me feel satisfied. It was a powerful image of protection and freedom, an irreplaceable safeguard. Throughout the bridge construction, Karen continued to monitor the work from a distance, occasionally standing on the sidewalk, observing like an architectural critic. Whenever she saw me working, she would approach and start complaining. "You can't build this in our neighborhood, Tom. This is not a legal structure." Her criticisms only made me more determined. Although Karen didn't directly stop the work, I could feel her covert opposition. However, I didn't care. Everything I was doing was legal, and I was ready to defend my rights with this bridge. Every step of the construction process was carefully documented, not only as evidence if any legal issues arose, but also to share this story with the community. The next morning, when I opened the window and looked out into the yard, I couldn't help but smile as I saw Karen's SUV stuck in the trench I had just dug. Just as I had predicted, her car couldn't cross the 4-foot-deep, 5-foot-wide trench. I thought to myself, thanks, HOA. I think the president now knows what complying with regulations means. Before I could celebrate, I heard grumbling from outside. Karen's car door slammed open with such force that I thought she would charge straight into the trench. She walked toward my house, looking as angry as ever, her lips tightly pressed. "Tom," she shouted, "what the hell did you do? What is this trench? I stepped outside, keeping a gentle smile on my face, not in a hurry. "Oh, good morning, Karen. How do you like it? This trench isn't just for decoration. It's a legitimate security measure. The city has approved it for me," I said proudly. Karen's eyes lit up, probably not because I had just said something clever, but because she was absolutely furious. "Are you crazy? Fill in this trench right now. You can't just dig this thing in the middle of our neighborhood. And now you've got my car stuck." She stared at the SUV stuck in the trench with a face that couldn't be more embarrassed. I smiled, unfazed. "If you want, I can lend you a shovel and a few tools to help you push your car out. Otherwise, I think your car will have to wait until I lower the bridge." I pointed to the newly erected drawbridge next to it, making her even angrier. Karen didn't accept this humor. She yelled, "You don't understand, Tom. If you don't fill in this trench, I'll sue you. I'll make your life a living hell." She stood there, fists clenched, as if preparing for a real battle. I shrugged lightly, still smiling. "Oh, Karen, I don't think you know that I actually enjoy working with the law. I've done thorough research and even asked my lawyer about this. I can build this trench and drawbridge without breaking the law. If you'd like, I can have my lawyer explain it to you in more detail." I saw her wide-eyed, clearly unable to cope with my calm and confident tone. Karen started pacing back and forth, her fingers still pointing towards the trench. "This is a violation. I'll make everyone in this neighborhood hate you. I'll call the HOA to kick you out of this community. You'll never live peacefully here again." I sat down on the chair, sipping my coffee leisurely. "Karen, you might not know, but I'm pretty sure everyone in the neighborhood is watching this drama unfold. They all see that I'm just protecting my property. As for the HOA, they've made life difficult for all of us. You can't do anything to me anymore." Suddenly, a few neighbors started to poke their heads out from their windows and doors, seemingly trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. An elderly neighbor, whom I had only met a few times, called out from the window, "Congrats, Tom. I never thought we'd have a fortress in the neighborhood. Now the HOA will definitely think twice." Karen heard this and got so furious that her face almost turned red. "The whole neighborhood will never forgive you, Tom. I'll make everyone hate you." She turned, stormed off the yard, still pointing at me. "You'll regret this when I'm done," she yelled as she walked away. As Karen left, I saw some neighbors laughing through their windows. I couldn't help but think to myself that I had just done the right thing. Although defeated from the start, Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She continued to fight like a controlling figure who would never accept defeat. The day after her failure to demand that I fill in the trench, Karen immediately returned with her plan, but this time, she decided to pull in the HOA members. Karen wasted no time calling each member of the HOA, demanding they intervene and do whatever they could to force me to remove what she called a violation of regulations. However, each time she called, the response was not what she expected. A few HOA members, who had grown tired of Karen's leadership, began turning their backs on her. Some even directly told her that my actions were legal and that they couldn't do anything to stop it. Repeated refusals only fueled Karen's anger, and she was left feeling helpless. "This is unbelievable. You're all betraying me," Karen screamed on the phone, but the more she tried to pressure them, the fewer people agreed with her. The constant rejections hit her pride like slaps in the face. One HOA member even told her, "If you keep pushing this, it'll only make the neighborhood more chaotic. We don't want these kinds of issues anymore." This made Karen even more furious. Things were starting to spiral out of her control. My story quickly spread throughout the neighborhood, becoming a hot topic of conversation. Neighbors who had been indifferent or silent before now started to realize that what I was doing was the right thing. Not only was I protecting my property, but I was also standing up against a power structure trying to invade everyone's personal lives. Many people in the neighborhood, who had previously been too afraid to speak out, began showing their support. Some even came to see me and said they really liked my idea and hoped I would continue fighting for my rights. Karen couldn't handle the increasing opposition from the community. Not only did she feel isolated, but she was also furious that she couldn't control the situation. So, she decided to escalate her actions. One of the new tactics she used was gathering signatures from neighbors to file a lawsuit with the city, demanding intervention and forcing me to remove the trench and drawbridge. She brought along a giant petition and started knocking on doors, trying to persuade everyone to sign the petition with the claim that I was invading public space, and creating a traffic hazard. However, Karen's plan failed once again. Very few people in the neighborhood supported her. In fact, many refused to sign the petition, and some even directly told her that they didn't want to get involved because they felt what I was doing was legal. "I don't see anything wrong with Tom protecting his property," one neighbor said directly to Karen. "You're just making a big deal out of nothing, and you'll only make everyone lose patience." The community's opposition not only frustrated Karen, but also made her so angry that she could no longer control herself. She began to feel as though she had lost her power and could no longer control the lives of those around her. Angrily, unable to manipulate HOA members and the neighbors, Karen decided to use even more underhanded methods to try to force me to give up. She started to cause disturbances in HOA meetings, repeatedly offering baseless reasons to demand fines for me. Karen even began organizing small boycotts to isolate me from neighborhood communications, persuading others not to interact with me. Under Karen's leadership, the HOA began to lose its influence and control over the situation. What was once seen as strict regulations and unquestionable power now became nothing but empty words. As Karen continued to try and interfere with my life, no one in the HOA was willing to support her anymore. My story was not only widely known within the neighborhood, but also started to attract the attention and support of many residents in the area. Although Karen continued to pressure me with threats and demands for the HOA to intervene, I noticed that her support in the community had drastically dwindled. HOA members, although some still tried to maintain their support for Karen, had begun turning their backs on her. They no longer wanted to see the community torn apart by endless legal battles created by one person. Meanwhile, I continued building my drawbridge, constantly upgrading and refining the structure. I knew this was just the beginning of my plan. The failure of the HOA was a signal to me that I could go even further. I didn't just want to protect my property. I also wanted to expose Karen's and the HOA's wrongdoings. I began preparing for the next step in my plan, gathering more information and evidence about Karen's and the HOA's violations. After a few days of research and revisiting HOA records, I discovered illegal spending and even signs of power abuse. Karen, who had created a threatening and controlling environment all this time, was truly not as innocent as she had appeared in her activities. This was the evidence I needed to uncover the truth and bring her into the light. Not only did I fight legally, but I also decided to share my story on social media. Although I had always been quite private about my personal life, I felt that it was time for people to know the truth about what was happening in this neighborhood. I recorded a video of my trench and drawbridge, then posted it on major social media platforms. The video quickly went viral, attracting the attention of the online community. The images of the deep trench, the simple yet powerful medieval-style drawbridge, built as a symbol of protecting personal property and rights, left a strong impression on viewers. Immediately, thousands of people from across the country began sharing my story, offering their strong support. Many left comments like, "Tom is the hero of this neighborhood," or "Thanks for standing up against HOA tyranny." Those who had once feared Karen now felt encouraged. They began to speak up, no longer staying silent in the face of injustice. Stories from neighbors were shared, reflecting Karen's previous abuses of power. For a long time, they had felt oppressed and fearful of Karen, but now they realized they were not alone. People in the neighborhood also started to view me as a hero. Although I never thought of myself as one, I realized that my actions not only protected my own rights, but also helped others regain confidence and power within their own community. I wasn't just confronting Karen. I was helping the entire neighborhood realize they no longer had to be victims of control and oppression. My story, with the trench and drawbridge, was no longer just my personal battle. It had become a symbol of resistance and justice. Those who had been quiet before now started to stand up, offering thanks and supporting me. Gradually, a small movement began to form in the neighborhood. Unable to bear the embarrassment and pressure she was facing, Karen finally decided to shift tactics. She could no longer stand to see me winning, and she couldn't tolerate the public exposure of her behavior. Even though people in the neighborhood were gradually turning their backs on her, Karen refused to give up. This time, she decided not just to threaten me, but also to take the matter to court, hoping to reverse the situation and force me to back down. Karen began filing a lawsuit against me, accusing me of violating community protection regulations and creating a potential danger to the safety and aesthetics of the neighborhood. In the lawsuit, she repeatedly emphasized that the trench and drawbridge I had built were dangerous structures that could cause accidents for the residents, and that what I had done was a violation of landscape and public safety regulations. The trial began, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy. Karen, standing beside her legal team, kept her usual arrogant expression, although deep down, she was worried. She had prepared meticulously for this fight, not only wanting to win, but also wanting to set an example for anyone who dared challenge her authority. She knew that if she lost, it wouldn't just be personal humiliation. It would be a loss in the power struggle that had lasted all this time. But I wasn't an easy target. After everything that had happened, I wasn't just standing here to defend my structure. I was standing here to expose all the wrongdoings that Karen and the HOA had been trying to conceal for so long. Karen started with her accusation. The actions of the defendant, Tom, not only violate HOA regulations, but also pose a potential threat to the safety of the community. The trench he dug was done without prior notice, and the drawbridge is a danger to all residents in the area. She pointed at me, her face tense, her tone challenging. I smiled, not rushing to speak. I had prepared for this moment. I had studied every clause, every regulation. I knew exactly what I needed to do to counter Karen's accusations. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up straight, my gaze sharp, and my voice steady. Your Honor, I have complied with all the city's regulations regarding personal property protection. Every structure I have built has been legally permitted, and everything I've done is in full compliance with the law. In fact, I even notified the HOA about these changes. The trench I dug is not only to protect my property, but it also prevents unauthorized access to my private area. I pulled a copy of the city permit from my pocket and threw it onto the table in front of the judge. Karen saw the permit, her face turning pale. But she didn't give up easily. This permit doesn't apply to the danger caused to this neighborhood. The trench is a potential hazard, and his drawbridge, an uncontrollable structure, it could collapse at any time. You're talking about danger, but you haven't mentioned the danger of my privacy being invaded all this time. I continued, not hesitating. You and the HOA have repeatedly violated my property rights, imposing unreasonable regulations on my life without my consent. The trench and the drawbridge are what I had to do to protect myself, not some harmful structure as you're claiming. At this point, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. The people in the courtroom began whispering to each other. A few of my neighbors were present at the trial, and they all knew the truth about what Karen had done over the years. Neighbors began looking at each other, some nodding, as if they were empathizing with me. Karen couldn't stop her anger. You can't just destroy our neighborhood because of personal disputes. You'll pay for this. I didn't let her distract me. You can continue to threaten me, but I have gathered enough evidence to refute everything. I have not only protected my rights, but also exposed your abuse of power. I pointed to the copies of documents I had gathered. I have clear evidence that you've used HOA funds for personal purposes, not for the benefit of the community. You've abused your position to do illegal things. I presented the evidence, including copies of the HOA's financial documents I had found, which showed the money Karen had spent on vacations and expensive personal items. These documents not only proved Karen's greed and abuse of power, but also showed that she didn't deserve to continue holding power in the HOA. The trial became more heated than ever. Witnesses couldn't stay still. Some began whispering, exchanging information they knew. A few of my neighbors also attended the trial, and they began speaking up in support of me. Among them was John Miller, a neighbor who had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years and who had been pressured by Karen into complying with the HOA's unreasonable regulations. He stood up, his voice ringing out. I've lived here a long time, and what Tom is doing is completely legal. Not only that, he's following city regulations and has fully informed the HOA. Karen has been abusing her power. Without people like Tom, we'd be living in a community controlled by people like Karen. John's statement silenced the courtroom. Other neighbors began looking at each other. Some of them stood up and voiced their support for me. Karen, unable to bear it, looked around the room as if searching for approval, but all she received was silence. Karen turned away, her face flushed with anger. You won't get away with this, Tom. I won't let you win. The trial had lasted all day, and now, With all the evidence presented, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. After hearing my defense and the clear evidence of Karen's wrongdoing, the judge didn't hesitate before declaring, "With all the available evidence, I declare that Karen has no legal basis to sue Tom. Everything Tom has done is legal, and Karen's attempt to abuse her power within the HOA is unacceptable." Karen's face turned ashen, her eyes wide with fury. She had thought she could turn the tables, but now she had to face the greatest defeat of her life. The people in the courtroom began to murmur, and you could feel the celebratory atmosphere of those witnessing my victory. The judge continued, "Given the lack of evidence to support the accusations and Karen's misconduct in her role as HOA leader, I recommend that she be held legally accountable for her actions in this community." After the verdict, Karen silently left the courtroom, her eyes betraying disappointment and hatred. The crowd around her watched as she walked away, and some even whispered, "Finally, she has to pay." Right after the trial, the battle didn't end there. I knew that while Karen being sued and losing in court was a huge victory, I needed to make sure she truly paid for her power abuse within the HOA. And I was ready for the next battle, this time at the HOA meeting. That day, the HOA meeting took place in a tense atmosphere. The HOA members sat around the conference table, but this time, all eyes were on Karen, who had previously always been confident and domineering. Today, Karen had no power left. She knew that no one supported her anymore, and that losing in court was the biggest shock of her life. The meeting began, and I wasted no time. I stood up, pulled a thick folder from my bag, and started presenting the evidence. The photos I had collected of Karen's violations, along with the financial documents I had found, were placed on the table for everyone to see. These are irrefutable pieces of evidence. Karen has abused her power in the HOA for personal gain, including using HOA funds for personal purposes, from expensive vacations to luxury personal items, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. The HOA members exchanged glances, and some began staring at Karen, who could no longer maintain her usual confident expression. Karen tried to speak in her defense, but this time she couldn't justify herself. Everything was crystal clear. "It's impossible. These are false accusations." Karen tried to deny, but her voice was weak, lacking conviction. She looked at the members of the board, but none of them stood by her. The cold, silent stares were the clearest answer. I continued, providing more solid evidence. The financial reports, the emails Karen had sent to other members, everything pointed to her corruption over the years. "This is proof that Karen doesn't deserve to be the HOA president. We can't allow someone like her to continue leading this community," I said. After all the evidence was presented, the atmosphere in the room grew so tense that no one dared speak. Karen sat silently, her hands clenched, but she couldn't say anything. She had been completely exposed. Finally, the meeting concluded with a decision that couldn't have been clearer. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president. Everyone in the room began discussing the next steps, and an official investigation into her actions was immediately initiated. The rumors, the power abuses Karen had caused over the years, were now verified, and nothing would ever be the same again. Karen stood up, her face pale, but there was nothing she could do except lower her head and leave the meeting room, no longer possessing the power to fight back. I knew she would never return as the HOA president. The next day, when the HOA meeting ended with Karen being dismissed and an official investigation opened, things became more intense than ever. It was unbelievable. Karen's actions, from abusing her power to using HOA funds for personal gain, had now come to light. But this wasn't just about the HOA meeting. It had caught the attention of the authorities. The police began to get involved. After reviewing the evidence and information I had gathered, along with the financial reports and documents I provided, the authorities began investigating Karen's misconduct within the HOA. Specifically, the use of HOA funds for personal trips and inappropriate expenditures was a clear violation. One early morning, as I was preparing for a normal workday, I received a notification from a friend in the legal department that the police had officially arrived at Karen's house to arrest her. Karen was arrested for corruption and abuse of power, and the documents I provided were enough to initiate formal charges. The story of Karen's arrest and investigation didn't stop in our small neighborhood. My story and Karen's began to spread beyond the community, attracting media attention. Reporters from local TV stations and major newspapers began calling for more information. Interviews were held, and the story of corruption within the HOA became a hot topic. HOA president arrested for abuse of power and corruption in the community. These big headlines began appearing on news sites, capturing the attention of thousands. Articles exposing Karen's wrongdoings, from using HOA funds for expensive vacations to imposing unreasonable rules on residents, shocked and angered many people. Meanwhile, the video about my trench and drawbridge also started to gain significant attention from the online community. People began sharing my story at lightning speed. The online community rallied behind me, sharply criticizing Karen for her abuse of power. Tom fought not just for his own rights, but for all the residents in this neighborhood. "Thank you for standing up against HOA tyranny," one person commented on my video. Compliments kept pouring in, and I began receiving thousands of messages from people I had never met, thanking me for helping them rethink power dynamics in their own communities. My video of the trench and drawbridge went viral, becoming a symbol of legal resistance. Interviews with me and my neighbors were broadcast on TV programs, highlighting the story of how one person stood up against injustice in their community. Karen not only faced arrest for corruption, but also had to face multiple other charges. The police continued to investigate the improper expenditures and her long-standing abuse of power. The evidence I provided, along with support from the residents, formed a solid case that forced Karen to face the consequences of her actions. As the story spread through the media, Karen became the subject of public outrage. The online community relentlessly criticized her, and her neighbors also started speaking out. "What has Karen done to this community? What has she done with our money?" one of Karen's neighbors angrily said during an interview. With clear evidence and the support of the community, Karen could no longer justify her actions. Ultimately, she faced a criminal investigation and could be facing severe penalties. The whole neighborhood, after years of living under oppression, finally felt relieved. Karen was no longer the person in power within this community. And so, after a long struggle, Tom not only protected his own rights, but also helped the community regain justice. Karen's investigation and arrest were not just a legal victory, but also a powerful lesson about abuse of power and the importance of standing up for one's rights. Though Karen had tried many times to reverse the situation, in the end, it was Tom's determination and clear evidence that allowed the truth to be revealed. The community in this neighborhood could now breathe a sigh of relief, no longer living under the control and oppression of someone unworthy of power. Tom's story wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for justice. This story proved that even when you face powerful forces, as long as you have persistence, intelligence, and justice on your side, you can still win. Tom, once an ordinary citizen, became a symbol of fairness, of standing up against injustice. So what do you think about this story? Do you agree with how Tom fought back? Or do you have a different opinion on how power should be used in communities? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the next dramatic and exciting stories. Thank you for following the story, and let's continue our journey to seek truth and justice.